Good morning and welcome to the 25th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. The first item on our agenda is to take evidence from two panels of witnesses on responding to long-term fiscal pressures as part of our pre-budget scrutiny 2026-27. Our first evidence-taking session is a round-table discussion, and I'd like to say good morning and welcome to the table to Andy Whitty, Director of Strategic Policy and Corporate Governance, Colleges Scotland; Stacey Dingwall, Head of Policy and External Affairs Scotland, Federation of Small Businesses; Elaine Morrison, Director, Boosting Capital Investment, Scottish Enterprise; Tom Ockenden, External Affairs Coordinator, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations; and Leslie Jackson, Deputy Director, Universities Scotland. So thank you all for your written submissions. We have around 90 minutes for this session. So what will happen is I'm going to kick off by asking a question to Andy. And then if anyone wants to come in on the back of that, just let me know, put your hand up or nod, or otherwise just be as if you're at an auction, so to speak. You won't have to end up buying any candlesticks or any obscure paintings, don't worry about it. But let me know you want to come in and we'll have a free-flow discussion as possible. If we get stuck at any point, I've got questions from each of your papers that I might come in on. I might just come in on that anyway to move things forward. But please feel free to say whatever you wish, when you wish, and make as many contributions as possible, same as members. So without further ado, Andy, at the very start of your Colleges Scotland submission, in terms of talking about specific fiscal sustainability challenges, you said it's vital that Scotland maximises the participation and contribution of its population. Gaining the participation in the labour market of those who are currently not in work, education or training, and with support for people who face barriers to work such as neurodiversity or disability, and ensuring access to appropriate training, qualifications and upskilling aligned to Scotland's economic needs. So I just wonder if you can expand on that for us, please.
Yes, thank
and
you.
The College of Scotland fit in, obviously, with that objective.
Yeah, no, thank you, Convener. I mean, I think the context is important here. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a meeting that was called by the Under-Secretary of State for Scotland, and the Deputy Chair of the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council was there, Professor Dame Nancy Rothwell, and gaining evidence. So they're a non-partisan advisory group. And after the introductions, literally the first word she said was skills. So whenever they'd been round the country and she'd done lots of forums, the issue that was kept getting raised was skills. And I think in this, when we're looking at how we deal with the long-term fiscal pressures, and in particular what the Scottish Fiscal Commission raised in regard to those Scottish-specific fiscal challenges, then I think maximising participation in the labour market is absolutely crucial, and then skilling up that maximum participation is equally crucial. And so that needs to be those that aren't currently in work or even education. We need to often younger people, we need to maximise the participation there. And so the capacity within the college sector, which is the skills engine of Scotland across the piece, needs to be maximised. And the challenge has been that almost £1 in 5 has been removed from the college sector's budget over the last 3 years. That's Audit Scotland figures. A new report is due out at the beginning of October. I suspect that figure will have increased by the last figure of 17%, so almost £1 in every 5. And so that has a devastating impact on the ability to deliver skills when actually the capacity needs to increase. And particularly for the long-term sustainability, we need to look at helping those that are furthest from the workforce as well, those that maybe need a bit of extra support, wraparound care, maybe the disabled, to get those people back into work to maximise the labour market. Now, those need more resource to do that. But the reality of really hard decisions that individual colleges need to make is that, when there's £1 in 5 gone, they've got to make really hard decisions. And so often it's those support services that are no longer there. But we need to make sure that the resource is there and the right amount is there. And then I suppose that the final point just to open with is then when we're looking at reskilling and upskilling people who are returning to the labour market or needing to because their job has changed or they've been made redundant again, that the colleges are there as that community anchor, as that place where those skills can be gained. And so I think for the long-term sustainability of Scotland and for the economy, I think it's ensuring that that skills capacity is there, and that's under severe strain at the moment because of the cuts that have happened over the last few years.
And I mean, you've also said in this same subject area that it's important to align economic growth spending to gaps in skill and labour market needs.
Yes, I think that skills alignment is really crucial. And James Withers produced a report just over 2 years ago now, and skills alignment, one of the recommendations was bringing that back into Scottish Government, which is happening. It's happening slowly. I think it needs to be a key piece of getting to the point of how we're going to do that. I think up to this point it's identified what needs to be done, and I think now we need to identify how that works and how that alignment's going to happen. I think that sits in line with the public service reform strategy and agenda of aligning things. But equally, there needs to be the finance behind that, because there's no point in having a strategy and an approach if there isn't then the funding to do it. And we need to maximise, for the long-term benefit of Scotland, we need to maximise all of the investment. And so there's inward investment by companies, and that's good, but we do know some of those companies are needing to bring in skilled workers from out with the country. Just recently, about 2,000 welders from the Philippines, I think they were, needed to be brought in to do the work. Yet we have colleges with welding kit sat empty some of the week because they haven't got the funding, they haven't got the credit. I don't want to go into the technicalities, but they haven't got the funding to allow them to utilise that kit as much as actually it could be done. And so I think that skills alignment is really critical. I think that's a really important point, and I think how we do that and working that through is going to be a crucial next step.
Okay, now I've got John and Craig wanting to come in, but before I move to John, Leslie, you've said in your paper you've expressed concern about the Flexible Workforce Development Fund, of which Open University and College have provided, valued at £10.5 million a year, being discontinued in 23-24. And you said that the Open University alone had to turn away over 1,000 learners. And you go on to say that the Scottish Funding Council's Upskilling Fund, previously valued at £7 million a year, was also discontinued in 24-25, before going on to say that more flexibility within graduate apprenticeships are required to respond to employer needs. So I wonder if you could touch on some of these issues.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, just to say, I completely echo everything that Andy has said about, we completely recognise the fiscal constraints and pressures facing the Scottish Government, but equally, I think the point about long-term planning is a really important one. So a number of the funds that you referenced there were short-term, so they were single year. They were either removed at the end of the year, or some of them were removed or reduced in year. And that makes it really, really difficult for universities to plan and to recruit effectively onto courses. I mean, we know that more than 85% of new jobs in Scotland by 2035, as referenced in our submission, will be at graduate level. But we also know that the population of 18-year-olds is going to start to decline beyond 2030. And when we think about, I think we'll all be working longer into what used to be the retirement period. We want to have that opportunity to upskill and reskill with high-level skills. When we think about the transition in the energy sector, for example, away from oil and gas towards more renewables, a lot of those jobs will be at graduate level, and the universities stand ready and are already working with our local partners regionally to think about what does that mean for the skills needs of the workforce. But we need the flexibility to adapt the model that we've currently got. So we both need an injection of funding to stabilise the current funding settlement. It's set out in our submission. We're you will know, we're really struggling as a university sector at the moment in terms of funding core teaching, core research provision. The dependence on cross-subsidy has really been pushed beyond sustainable to this point. And so we need to increase that core funding, but we also need to think about how can we be more flexible with provision going forward. We want to move beyond full-time undergraduate places, but within the capped funding model that we currently have, we're constrained with that at the moment. So we're constrained by limited flexibility in graduate apprenticeships. It takes an awful lot of time and an awful lot of effort to get a new graduate apprenticeship course introduced at the moment. So what we're seeing is institutions creating provision that's needed locally, but outside of that graduate apprenticeship model, because we can't get the provision in place quickly enough. We've seen it with planning degrees, we've seen it with podiatry degrees, but that the university takes a hit for that. They don't receive the fee element from SAS because they're not designed as graduate apprenticeships. So you're really seeing the universities trying to be innovative, working with those local and regional partners to say, what are the future skills that we want to be able to put in place here? What sits at college level? What sits at university level? What might sit with employers themselves? How do we contribute to that mix? But at the moment, we're constrained both by the design of the funding and by the actual amount of funding that's currently in the system.
Okay, thank you for that. John, to follow by Craig.
You covered some of the things I was going to ask, because that very line about aligning economic growth spending to gaps in skill, and I was going to ask Andy, are we clear? He's given the example of welders, which came up when we visited the advanced manufacturing place as well. Are we clear where the gaps in skills are? And then are young people clear where the gaps in skills are? Because it's all very well us knowing, or you knowing, but if young people aren't going for the right places for the jobs, which takes me on to universities, and also Scottish Enterprise talk about the graduates who are in non-graduate jobs. I mean, that says to me we are sending too many young people to university. We should be sending some of them to train as welders instead of doing degrees. Andy?
No, thanks, John. I mean, I think
as well, if you want to, and that's sorry.
No, sorry. So I think the what we need to have in regard to skills is it in the forefront of planning at the start of when new policies come forward. For example, if you look at one that's probably relevant for this morning around housing, the Scottish Government declared that housing emergency in May 24. They came up with a number of different elements to deal with it, including 4.9 billion of investment to increase housing of all types. Yet what wasn't in there was a thought about the skilled workforce needed to deliver that. And so we've now got the Construction Industry Training Board, CITB, saying that there's 4,000 extra workers a year needed over the next 3-4 years to deal with that. And other skilled bodies around electricians and plumbers, gas fitters are reporting the same thing. So we do know where those gaps are in these industries and also some of the green industries coming through.
Do the schools know that? Do the schools know where the gaps are?
So I think you touched on careers as well, which I think is an important element. I mean, I think there's been a number of career reviews and initiatives and collaboratives over the last few years. And I think we do need to continue strengthening careers advice so that all of this lines up. So the skills needs of the economy, the identifying and making that clear, the planning up front about you need to fund those skills in order to meet the capacity. And I think that's where I touch on sort of cross-portfolio elements in other bits of my evidence, where we need to look to see, so when there is a housing emergency and a response by the government, then there needs to be a recognition that as well as providing that, in order to provide the housing, we need to also provide the skilled workforce to build that. And that needs to be planned in from the beginning, and some of that funding could then come across and support that to ensure we're not in this position. And I think the careers advice being strengthened is part of that circle as well. John, thanks.
Yeah, Leslie, I mean, John obviously said, well, yeah, what he said. But in your submission, you've also said 86% of new jobs in Scotland in 2035 will be at graduate level, which I found astonishing, really, because we've just heard how we need welders and plumbers and bricklayers and, you know, whatever. You know, we also need people to work in retail and hospitality and God knows where else. So how is this 86%? This can't be right, surely.
When we think about the future development of the Scottish Government and the focus on, I'm sure Scottish Enterprise will want to say something about this as well, the focus on high growth sectors, that's what we want for the Scottish economy. We want the Scottish economy to be growing, to be people to be earning good salaries, career progression, and that applies to every job and every kind of role, you know, be it something that's kind of high end that requires a graduate degree, whether it's, you know, these crucial supporting roles that Andy's spoken about there. I think in terms of the number of people going to university, it is a demand-led model. I think that I'm sure none of us would want to restrict the aspiration of our young people in terms of what they want to study and what they want to go on and do in life. I completely agree with Andy about the point about careers advice is so important, that young people understand where those opportunities will be it locally, be it nationally, be it internationally. You know, we don't want to hold back our Scottish young people when they're thinking about what they want to do and the choices that they want to make.
Would you accept that some young people are choosing a subject at university that they quite like the idea of, but they have no idea about whether there'll be a job at the end of it? I
mean, I think, you know, we have a 4-year degree here. I think that we need to think about the transferability of skills. So, for example, in the renewable energy industry, one of the most popular, one of the most, one of the most highly represented degrees is social sciences. Now, people may go in doing a social science degree with no thought of working in that sector, but they're experiencing careers advice at university, also opportunities to go out and engage with businesses, particularly in that kind of regional space, thinking about where will those opportunities be for us into the future. I do think that it's about the range of provision as well, and just making sure that what's at college level, what's at university level. You'll be aware, of course, we also have really well established articulation routes between college and university, so it may well be that somebody starts on one path and then you know, during the course of their studies they think about going in another path, or you know, perhaps they graduate from college with an HND and they go on and they do the thing that they wanted to do. So I do think that we have that extra element of flexibility in Scotland because of the 4-year degree, that there is the opportunity for young people to move around should they choose to do so. But we are really focused on, you know, where is that aspiration? How do we encourage people to meet that, to develop those transferable skills, and then to think as broadly as possible when they're coming out of university, what is it can I do with those transferable skills? What are the options open to me?
Okay, Craig, to follow by Liz.
Thank you, Convener. Andy, just to take you back to labour market participation, in your response to question 6, you say, and I quote, barriers to work in Scotland are well understood and preventative spend, particularly investment in childcare, will bring about more labour participation. Given that there's been a significant investment through the 1140s hours programme, have you seen any demonstrable shift of increased labour market participation amongst that target group that would give you confidence to say actually further investment would yield a benefit?
So I think the 1140 hours of childcare as a policy has been a really interesting approach to how that was done, because that was driven by a particular minister at the time, so there was a focus there, and that allowed as well as delivering the aspiration of the 1140 hours, it was also recognised that more of the workforce would need to be trained up to work in there, to manage it. And I think it also leads to the careers point that was mentioned earlier, that what was then able to be shown is that there is a career in this area of work. And so I think that combination of a policy and recognising the needed to fund the training and the skills of that did make it successful and work. And so, yes, I think that's been really helpful intervention to allow parents and carers to work if they want to. And I think that's one element of broadening the labour market participation, because I think that question was about growing the tax base, and and you grow the tax base by having more people working and getting them to the working position quicker. And that's where looking at those that maybe have never had a job before, never participated, and the targeted help that they would need in order to help them through that is another important aspect of that.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Just a quick related point, thank you, Convener, about part-time study. So I think that the 1140 hours equate to 2 and a bit days of childcare on a 52-week model. And I think that does create an opportunity for people who might not be ready to immediately enter the workforce, but who might be thinking about qualifications in advance of doing so. I think, as we've set out in our submission, the funding environment for part-time students is not on the same footing as for full-time students. You have to have a very low income in order to qualify for funding support for part-time study, and we're really concerned at the moment that there might be people out there who are put off studying part-time for a university degree because the funding is not available for help with fees and maintenance, etc., to the same level that it is for full-time students.
Yeah, I mean, because you've said that the £25,000 limit's been unchanged for the last 10 years. I have to say, though, when I was at university, it was part-time. It was only 12 hours a week of classes. So I don't know what you mean by part-time, because I mean that was pretty much part-time as far as I recall, and I understand.
I'm sure you were doing your non-contact study, Convener.
Sorry?
I'm sure you were doing your non-contact study hours.
Moving swiftly on. Listed followed by Michael.
Can I ask you, you've been very strong in your submission about the problem, the restrictions that you're under as a sector and the inflexibility which you spoke about just a little while ago, and perhaps the difficulty that will have for trying to be innovative and doing new things. Can I ask you, what do you think has to happen to get a new funding model, a different funding model that does lead to greater fiscal sustainability?
That's a really good question. I think we need a cross-party discussion about what we want from universities going forward, how we're going to pay for that fundamentally. We have started those conversations. We are really glad that there has been a cross-party willingness to engage in some of those conversations. We recognise it's very difficult. We recognise in places it's very controversial. So I'm just going to say straight up, it's not about fees versus free. It's about thinking about what does the holistic model look like as we go forward, and really thinking about, I mentioned the demographic change from 2030. I think we're all agreed, including universities, that what we're going to be delivering going forward to meet the needs of the economy and Scottish society is not necessarily what we've been delivering, or certainly not in the way that we've been delivering it in recent decades. So I think it's round the table, it is that discussion about what does that future look like. How can the sector be more efficient and effective? I think the universities are absolutely ready and willing to have that conversation. We already have a lot of work in terms of things like shared services. We want to push that further. But we know that the trajectory that we're on at the moment with a funding model is not working anymore. We're too reliant on international student fees. We don't want to be in that space. So an openness and a willingness to engage in that conversation, I think, is a good start.
And do you think there's enough urgency about this? Because obviously we've had examples of institutions in Scotland that have had very considerable fiscal difficulties and almost a question of existential difficulties. Do you think this is urgent enough to resolve matters as quickly as we can?
We've certainly made a lot of progress in the last few months, and so I certainly think it is the #1 priority for University Scotland over the remainder of this parliamentary term. I know that we have had a really positive response when we sought to engage across the political spectrum in this space and with other partners as well. So it's certainly something that we are hoping to see progress on in months rather than years, because I think, as you say, there is plentiful evidence at the moment about the situation that we're currently facing.
Okay, thank you.
Michael, to follow by Elaine.
Thank you. Leslie, for yourself. I was struck by the call for a transformation fund in your submission. The Cabinet Secretary for Education said to the Chamber back on the 24th of June, I recognise that many institutions have over recent years worked proactively in response to a challenging operating environment to rationalise their operations, including their staffing levels. However, there's a need for our universities to reflect on the levels of growth we have witnessed in some institutions during the pandemic in particular. Some of the planned job losses that are currently being experienced relate directly to that uncapped expansion. The costs that are being paid today are the unsustainable jobs that were created as a result of that. I think there's essentially a green light to universities across Scotland to shed jobs in comparison to your own call for more investment to try and bridge this challenge that Liz Smith rightly points at. Is that where do you think things are lighting now? Are universities taking the advice of the Cabinet Secretary, or are they waiting to try and find funding that can help them to make that change?
So I think every institution has a legal and a moral responsibility to be sustainable financially. And I think that's a responsibility to the students, first and foremost, absolutely to their staff, and absolutely to their wider communities in Scottish society. I think where you have a situation where your income is not meeting your outgoings, and you don't have a credible path to raising your income to a level that meets or exceeds those outgoings in sufficient time, then you are in a really difficult position. And I think that's what a lot of institutions are looking at the moment, is about how do we get ourselves onto a path that enables us to bring those kind of funding streams and expenditures in line. The point about efficiencies and effectiveness, absolutely, I think that every institution is looking at that at the moment. We are a genuinely collaborative sector. I mean, I think we have the figures, the 27 million we're already sharing a year just through joint procurement and especially in internet services, etc., through JISC. And we want to push that further. We want to look at the more radical opportunities for collaboration and shared services and what have you to really kind of ensure that you're driving maximum value from every single pound that's coming into the system. But it's the costs that, you know, it's...
It feels more urgent than a transformation fund, because the universities are acting now. I mean, we see strikes and industrial actions across the country now on campuses. I mean, significant job losses. So is there a mismatch here between what you're describing, which seems to be a more gentle approach, and actually what you're seeing in terms of what your member organisations are doing, which is, you know, there's a state of panic?
So I think, I don't know that... I'm not sure I would call it panic. I certainly think there's a state of urgency, and I do think it's the two things together. It's probably really important. So we need an injection of funding into core teaching and core research. We need that in the 2026 budget. We've been working on our submission paper for that budget, and we're very clear that it needs to be an above-inflation increase to those funding lines to help to kind of steady the ship. Alongside that, we're looking for funding to do the transformation work. We can't do the transformation work if we're still bleeding on teaching and research money. You know, we need that injection of funding, that vote of confidence in the sector to say we can maintain the core provision of the teaching and the research and everything that the universities are doing, and that creates some space to then look at how can we be more innovative and more effective. A lot of the low-hanging, in fact, I would say almost all of the low-hanging fruit is already gone in that space. So it does take time to develop those shared services, to work through, you know, all of the implications that they have when you are taking something forward like that. But in the meantime, yes, we do need that core funding, because the same as the colleges, the value of that funding has really fallen away in recent years through inflation, employer national insurance increases, and post-COVID costs, etc. It's just energy bills. It's relentless.
Not because the universities were over-dependent on overseas students, and then the UK government brought in visa restrictions, there was an immediate reduction in the number of overseas students, and that has cost the sector a colossal amount of money, not just in Scotland but also across the UK.
So that...
There was no plan B. There didn't seem to have been a plan B in case that happened. It was just like everything was you know, the sunny uplands. This was going to continue indefinitely, and universities weren't prepared for any change in policy on that.
So I think that cross-subsidy is built into the model. So universities lose money teaching Scottish domiciled students,
indeed.
and they lose money doing research. And the only source, I mean, there are obviously marginal sources, conference income, etc., but the main source of that cross-subsidy is that international student fee. So I would say that universities were driven in that direction by the model and the desire to keep up the quality and the excellence, and that drives the recruitment, and it also drives the quality of the education for Scottish domiciled students. You're right, I certainly would agree there has been a really dramatic change in that space because of the changes in the immigration regime, and that's just highlighted the problems with that cross-subsidy model. So I don't think it's something that universities wanted to do in and of itself. It was in order to pay for everything else that they were doing, and then we're now having to have a conversation about what can we continue to afford doing if that key source of cross-subsidy income suddenly declines.
Okay, thank you. Elaine, to follow by Ross.
I just wanted to add some thoughts, I suppose, from the perspective of business in relation to skills and labour market participation. So some of the things that we've touched on in the conversation so far, I think we're looking backwards. And really what we need to think about is what's that innovative business model that we're going to apply to these areas as we look forwards. Because the way things have happened in the past, the way business operated previously, 9 to 5 is no longer a function. The way care provision is, the timing of care provision hasn't changed to reflect the changes in working practices, and the skills provision is still very typically, employers will say, we can't get the skills because we can't get enough apprentices. Many of them are going on to do degrees, they're going on to do further studies. That's not what they need. They need people who are coming in younger, who are learning the skills of just turning up for work, of being present, of learning on the job to do more of these things. So there's a bit of a disconnect, I think, at the current time for the way the economy is driving us as we're moving forward, and therefore what those structures that are going to underpin that will need to be. Skills in the future, we all know there's not enough people in the workforce to do everything that we need to do as we go forward as it currently stands. The adoption of technological capabilities is going to be so core to then free up the people that can do the things that only people can do. And I think the encouragement to colleagues who are looking about the future skills provision on behalf of business is to say, let's make sure that we're safeguarding and preserving the skills required for those roles. And actually, it's our job then to encourage companies and other people's jobs to think about how can they use technology to offset that skills requirement. So there's lots of complexities in these things that I kind of sit together. But for me, the way we used to traditionally look at things has just changed so much over the course of the last 4 or 5 years.
I mean, I think there's a frustration because across the UK there's what according to your paper, 8.7 million individuals who are effectively economically inactive, and about of those who are actually economically inactive because of read that wrongly, sorry. You've got about 8.7 million people who have working limiting health conditions, but about 4.1 million of those work. So half of those people work, but we still have a situation, though, even though half of people who are in that situation work, where we have some 800,000 people economically inactive, and 200,000 of those are students, so I don't think we need to count them. I mean, for example, Federation of Small Businesses talks about 37% of people aged 16 to 24 being economically active. If we take out students, that figure's totally different. But what you've said in your paper is you've talked about some really innovative suggestions. You've talked about, for example, incentivising employers to recruit, retain and retrain older workers. I mean, a lot of older workers, they do have a habit of going to work. A lot of them don't. Not everyone wants to retire, or people will retire for one job. They might want to do something else or move part-time. But the one thing that you don't really have in the paper, it's not really a kind of, it doesn't really say how that could be achieved. So I wonder if you could maybe enlighten us a wee bit about that. You also talk about empowering employers to reimagine job design and embed flexible and phased retirement options across the workforce, which seems to contradict that. So one paragraph you're talking about making it almost easier for people to retire, while at the same time you're trying to get more older people into the workforce. And lastly, just while you're Well, I've got you on the spot, so to speak. It says you've got a growing trend for employers requesting workers return to the workplace. Well, yeah, I mean, the suggestion almost as if that's a bad thing. But obviously, transport networks rely on that kind of workforce to boost their incomes, as do hospitality sectors. And I mean, a lot of people actually, surely mental health-wise, benefit from working with colleagues, exchange of ideas. I mean, I'm a person who I don't want to spend my life on a screen or or in my house. I mean, one of the reasons I want to work is because I want to be with people, So, I mean, everyone's different, obviously, but I'm just wondering if you can respond to some of those points that you've made in the second page of your submission.
Yeah, I mean, I think those differences are the really important part in that, aren't they? It's not for everyone who wants to do these things. So it's actually about the balance. It's different perspectives that come at it, but essentially it's all about how do you retain people in employment for as long as they are willing to be in employment along the way. And for some people that does mean having that phasing opportunity, because lots of people who reach a stage in life, I'm moving there myself, are thinking, do I want to work forever? Possibly not, but do I want to still be doing something? Yep, absolutely. So having that phasing capability as a more standard offer is really important for individuals. But there are lots of people who have left business because they believe they were expected to leave business at a particular stage. The workforce culture that exists around
it used to be you used to had to leave at a certain age in many companies,
and anticipates your physicality. But lots of people now are much more physical at latter stages than they maybe were at different stages. So there's a huge cultural change that needs to take place. How do you do that is extremely challenging. It's education based. It's been able to showcase those who do it particularly well. Peer learning in this situation among business is the most kind of intuitive and respected place where you will go and adopt a practice because you see it working, you see people's profitability is still there, it's not been impacted by it. So being able to showcase those who are doing it well, being able to talk them through how did you go about that change. So one of the core things that we are looking at, this will come into the productivity conversation, but it's relevant. One of the core things that we focus on is leadership within a business. Leadership in Scotland is very underinvested. So leaders in business investing in themselves to be able to do that. Being able to step away from your business, learn about these changing practices, take that knowledge from other people, take the time to see how it can work is something that we're trying to affect. So change, risk, appetite, ambition, but really thinking about how to do it differently. And that piece I mentioned earlier about the models that we've done things traditionally for many, many decades are not going to be the models that are going to work for your employees in the future.
So the bit I started on was how do you incentivise employers to recruit, retain and retrain older workers? How do you get them to do that and change that mindset?
Specifically through peer learning. That's the singular approach that I would focus on. You can do all sorts of funds. You can always do funds that say, we will give you some participatory level of support. I don't think that's the right way to do it personally. I think the employer has to recognise the value that they're going to get from their employee and therefore want to do it. But there can be a cost associated with it. So if you're taking people from areas where that person needs different needs wrapped around them, then there probably is a cost to the business in some way. There might be some software that's required for use by a disabled or an elderly person, perhaps if your hearing is damaged along the way, etc. So there can be costs. So there could be things that public sector could choose to financially assist businesses with, either through taxation incentives or through grant participation. But personally, I think just businesses tend to do business with other businesses, and when they see people doing it really well and they recognise that that's good for their bottom line, they're more inclined to take it on.
Okay, thank you. Ross, followed by Tom.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Camille. Quick questions for Elaine and Leslie, both on the theme of how we get best value for public money. Just for Elaine, if I'm recalling this correctly, it was 4 years ago this month that Scottish Enterprise added conditionality around real living wage to grants it was issued. So just be interested in any reflections you've got about what the impact of that has been. Has it just resulted in more money going to the businesses who were already paying the real living wage? Has it resulted in some of the businesses that you're working with deciding to sign up and become real living wage employers? Has it tangibly boosted wages in the way it was intended to do? And for Leslie, I should start off by saying absolutely sympathise with the financial situation of the sector, recognise that it's not sustainable. Part of my challenge, though, is that I don't think universities are frank enough in understanding the political difficulties when they quite understandably come to government and parliament to ask for more funding. but very often bristle at the suggestion that there should be any conditions attached to that funding at all. So I'm wondering, are there any questions in the conversations taking place in the sector about being more open to the fact that if you are going to come and ask for more money from government, quite justifiably given the state of the sector, that it's pretty hard to do that with bloated, extremely highly paid senior management teams at one end, while you've got graduate teaching assistants at the other end who are being paid less than the real living wage on 0-hours contracts, etc. And actually, realistically, if the sector is to expect more public funding, then maybe it needs to concede that there will be more conditions attached to that funding as well.
Okay, so Ross, happy to kick off on that one. I think, yes, it has had a positive impact in some ways, so let me just expand on that a little bit. There are many businesses that we've worked with. I'm going to highlight the food manufacturing, food production companies, where typically your margin is a lot tighter than in some other businesses, and often these are lower paid jobs that come through in the economy, but they're quite, they've got a volume attached to them in the number of workers. So having that conditionality has resulted in employers changing their pay levels to do it. It's also been complicated because the addition of a real living wage means that it pushes all of the salary levels within the company somewhere up. If your bottom starts somewhere higher than you were previously, other things have to move somewhere along the way. Real living wage jobs are not our target as we're going forward. Higher value jobs are absolutely where we want to be. We want to increase the value of wages that are coming through. That helps tax. Actually, companies that are more productive tend to pay better wages. That's what evidence shows, is they tend to retain their workforce longer. So when we come back to not having enough workers available, if you want to be competitive in your business, the better terms that you can offer your employees, the more likely you're going to be to do that. So the conditionality itself has had some positive changes along the way, just to be specific on the question.
That's helpful, thanks.
Thanks.
Leslie?
So I think that we do have conditionality attached to funding at the moment when you think about things like the outcomes framework and the assurance model. So there is a lot of reporting and around quality as well that we would do to SSC and to government. But I think I'd probably come back to the point I made about the need for this cross-party conversation. And I think that you're right that we all need to come round the table prepared to have a really open and honest discussion about how the funding works and how we drive best value for it going forward. So I would certainly say on behalf of the sector, we're absolutely ready to have that conversation. There will be parts of it that are difficult for politically, and there will be parts of it that will be difficult for the sector as well. But I think now is the time for us to really have that conversation about a medium-term sustainable model, in fact, into the longer-term a sustainable model, and that we recognise that if that does result in more public money coming into the sector, we need to be really clear about what that money is for and what is that kind of joint vision that we have for the future of higher-level skills and education.
Thanks.
Well, I'm pleased to say I've got 4 people now wanting to come in. So first will be Tom, followed by Stacey.
Thanks. I just wanted to make a quick point on skills and housing and how those two things interact. And I guess echo Andy in that there are shortages in the kind of trades and construction needed to build housing, and that's more acute in rural areas of Scotland. And that really ramps up the cost of building homes and makes it a lot more difficult to deliver those homes. There's also a point about being realistic in the fact that it's not just shortages, it's an ageing workforce in a lot of them trades. And there's a limit to what age you can work at in those trades. And so retaining the older workforce for that isn't necessarily the answer to sorting out those shortages. And then there's the issue of a lack of homes and a lack of affordable homes in certain parts of the country is meaning that you can't get the skills and you can't get the workforce and you can't retain the workforce in the places where it needs to be because there is a lack of affordable housing. And so it's almost like you can't get the skills in the first place, but then when they do have the skills, people can't necessarily afford to stay where they want to work in that sector. So I guess it's just to hammer home the point that we need more affordable housing in certain parts of the country to retain the people who are working in those jobs.
Thank you. Stacey, to be followed by Michelle.
Certainly in agreement with what we're hearing from our members there. And that, in terms of employers being able to, small businesses are more likely to take on someone who's a bit further from the labour market, because they can offer that flexibility to someone. They're more likely to have a personal relationship with their employees and understand the flexibility and accommodation that they need. It's become this year even more expensive to employ someone, and unfortunately we are starting to see that have a bit of a chilling effect on our members in terms of their hiring intentions or just ability to hire people, to be honest, which is a shame, because, as I say, they are more likely to take on people who are further from the labour market, whether that's older people or apprentices as well. About 25% of our members will take on apprentices, which is an increase of about 5% on 2 years ago. Unfortunately, more are taking them on, but more are also having a negative experience of taking on an apprentice, which is unfortunately putting them off continue to do it in the future.
Sorry, what kind of negative experiences?
Just in terms of being ready to actually be in the workplace, those kind of softer skills. It's a big investment for an employer to take someone on. We talked about that, the cost of taking on an apprentice and that pushing up salary levels across the wider workforce. So it's quite an expensive investment for an employer to take if they're not seeing that return on investment. So if they've been burned, they are less likely to take someone on, which is a shame, because we know that those who have actually taken on an apprentice, the majority of them say it's a positive experience.
Are these people from school?
Yes.
I have to say, I've got a garage owner who says he takes on apprentices, but he says the first couple of years I just break stuff. It's always been like that. I mean, it's just getting to know how things actually work.
In terms of small businesses, they have a disadvantage as well. Someone might come in and do well, but then they get a better opportunity at a larger company, which is understandable, of course, but for a small business to take that risk and the investment is lost after a year.
When I was in Glasgow City Council, I have to say a wee anecdote. Glasgow City Council used to win all the training awards for all the best construction workers. And basically all the private businesses would hoover them all up at the end of the training course, and the City Council would be left with the others, so to speak. Way back in the 90s.
But in terms of the impact of, that means our members, small businesses aren't getting access to the staff that they need. So about a third of them in our latest national survey told us that they're having recruitment challenges, and of that third, 20% have had to cut the services that they offer as a result of not having enough staff. So it's having that real kind of knock-on effect of small business, the income they're able to generate, maintain their other staff. So it is quite worrying, the impact of staff shortages.
Okay, Michelle, to be followed by Andy.
Hi everybody. I've been listening to the session with interest, and as the convener sent out at the start, one of our key focuses is around fiscal sustainability, but we haven't really reflected thus far what we've danced in around the kind of UK balance sheet, which is pretty dismal, and that drives everything and ultimately flows through into what we see in Scotland. And we've almost got a kind of counterintuitive challenge in that we've touched on the availability of labour when we've got political drivers that are against immigration. We know that would be, that would be a key way of addressing some of these challenges. Also, I was surprised that, like Scottish Enterprise, your submission didn't mention artificial intelligence, because that's got so many links into what we've touched on, skills and productivity. And a gentle challenge back to Universities Scotland. Of course, you ended up in a position where you had an over-reliance on overseas students, but if you look at it from a business perspective, any business would be doing the risk analysis of having so many eggs in one basket of a critical kind of type of customer, if you like. So I suppose my question is that are we ready and up for this challenge, given the counterintuitive nature that I say, where we've got a backdrop of decreasing and very constrained public sector funding against a demand from everybody of we want more money, and for good reason often, to invest. So do we have the audacity of thinking? Do we have the leadership that we need? And do we properly understand the almost counterintuitive nature of the fiscal sustainability? I appreciate it's a pretty big question, but we've had a nice chat so far. But will this nice chat really start to shift the dial, is my question. And Elaine, you're nodding with me, so I'll give the...
Well, you clearly seem to be the woman who's prepared to answer that, for what I can see.
Gosh, where to begin in some of that, Michelle? I suppose, so AI should have been referenced within the submission, let me just say that from the outset.
You have referenced old technology, I have to say, in your submission, just not new technology.
It changes so quickly.
Yeah.
The focus within Scottish, the area that I'm leading within Scottish Enterprise at the moment is how do we drive up levels of capital investment within Scotland. A huge part of that is about technology adoption by business, of which AI is one type of capability that exists there. There's a huge unknown with it, so we see lots, and I did say earlier that actually let's use technology where we can and make sure we free up the skills for the things only people can do. There's a caveat that comes with all of that, of course, so if we bring this back to the fiscal scenario, if you think about Edinburgh City alone, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, the number of people employed in the knowledge economy in Scotland's capital, and it makes that contribution back into the tax take that comes through, is considerable. The application of AI could have quite a significant impact on those individuals and what those individuals do, and therefore what comes into the pot somewhere downstream. It can have a considerable impact on the teachings that come through the academic institutions.
Sorry, when you say considerable impact, do you mean positive, negative, or negative?
It could have. I don't know, I've got no crystal ball, but it could have. So we already see, I think it was a Gartner study, something like 20%. When they looked across professional bodies, several thousand companies across the world, there was something like a 20% saving that could be applied by use of artificial intelligence. Now, that's really positive because it can increase your productivity. Most employers at the current time look at it to say, how can it decrease their cost, i.e. how do we take jobs away and save some money along the way. So the balance just now is in trying to understand enough about the technological application to say, well, how do we plan now to be able to redeploy those jobs and that transfer of skills for the future? How do we get the companies using it in the right ways? It's not a very well kind of grounded sort of structure, governance structure that sits round about it at the moment. You know, there's a bit of a free-for-all that's happening around the world in terms of how you can use some of these things. So the pace of change is just so significant. But sorry, I'm trying to bring that back to the fiscal implications. So there's a positive in the fiscal use of it, because from a public perspective, there are things that technology can definitely do that people do at the current time. So there's potentially a positive, depending on the lens you look at it, to say you could take money out of the cost that's coming from public purse to do some of these things. But the other side in the economy is that this could replace, and it will replace people's jobs as we go forward. So there could be a negative unless we can reuse those people in a different way.
I know, and I know it was a massive question I asked, but I personally am not hearing a great deal about the strategic thinking of the challenges and enablers of AI, for example, from government, even in the face of recognising considerable uncertainty and complexity. But I feel as though it's a juggernaut that's travelling very fast towards us, and we're tinkering around the edges. It could, if we can get ahead of the game in terms of developing excellence around service provision, even basic things like in SMEs, actively developing agents to do some of the grunt work. There's things, it's an attitude about, we've only got one choice, which is to seize the opportunity, because the alternative guarantees failure.
Frankly, there's a fear of the unknown, I think, in many organisations. It's like, we're going to have to adopt this, but we have to do it this week, or, what's the implication going to be, as it's been pointed out, in terms of workforce, in terms of the whole structure. I mean, I led the first debate on AI in the Parliament way back in 2018, and with the information we had then about the impact on employment, it's completely different from what it is now, i.e. the sectors that would be most adversely affected and those that would be boosted, completely different from what the scenario is now. So I still think that's something that's being grappled with. I'm going to move on to capital investments in a couple of minutes, but I've still got a couple of folk who want to come in at the moment. Andy and John. Sorry, Michael, did you want to come in there? Capital. Yeah, okay, I'll bring you in then. Okay, Andy and John. And then move on to capital, because a few people have mentioned that specifically in their submissions.
Great. No, thank you, Convener. I was just wanting to pick up on the very valid point that was made about looking forward in regard to skills, because the current model is unsustainable. unsustainable on a funding level, unsustainable in the equity of funding. You know, the college is a skills engine, yet it's the lowest cost per head of funding across the education system. But apprenticeships is going to be really key going forward and streamlining that. And Colleges Scotland supportive of the tertiary bill that's currently going through, and that's because the alternative is the status quo, and the status quo delivers 40% of the funding to the colleges that actually deliver the training, and the rest is used elsewhere en route. So even without any additional monies, there are better ways and more streamlined ways to use that funding to help a new model around apprenticeship. There's other work-based learning models as well to address the point where maybe small businesses and the commitment to an apprentice and the costs associated with that. But there's other work-based learning models. And I think there's the skills alignment piece that we talked about earlier is really part of that answer of the new model going forward, as is sort of micro-credentials, you know, that idea of modular training. And I think there's an opportunity with the formation of Qualification Scotland going forward to really help. There's a potential there to help with that. The funding model needs to change as well to allow that regionalisation, so that you know, the regional economies is where that growth is going to come from. The colleges are regional players, they're of scale. So I think being able to give them that flexibility within the funding, single pot that can be used as needed, rather than lots of individual little pots that have their own rules and bureaucracy around them, is really key and important. And I think Flexible Workforce Development Fund was mentioned earlier. I think there's an opportunity for a Flexible Workforce Development Fund 2.0, which is looking at targeting at where the skill needs are for the economy, be it green skills, be it social care, those where that's needed. There was a report we had commissioned by Professor Joe Little just recently, which is in the public domain, and he looked at the policy environment of those countries that were delivering world-class vocational and technical training, and as well as recognition of colleges as the essential national skills producer. It also talked about alignment with the economic and business need. So it was around priorities driven by government but in consultation with business, and I think that needs to be part of the model going forward. But that alignment with the Economy Directorate is an element that I think needs exploring. So as well as funding through education, which absolutely should be, it's as the skills engine and driving the economy, I think closer links to the Economy Directorate is an area that in this new model going forward would be really good to explore.
Okay. John?
Thanks, Convener. It was to come back to Tom Ockenden, if I may, about the combination of housing and skills and so on, shortage of workers which we've had. I mean, I realise that SFHA itself does not build houses, but presumably you've got some kind of feel for it. But, I mean, is the sector moving on with the skills and technology as it might be? Because, for example, I've got CCG in my constituency. They do off-site building. I don't get the impression that off-site building has taken off in the way it might have, despite the fact it would presumably, I mean, it's a nicer environment for workers to work in, presumably older workers, it might suit them better than being on the site. And also things like, I saw an article recently about using robots to do bricklaying because we're short of bricklayers. I mean, is the sector really moving forward in that area?
So I guess the short answer is I don't know fully. The longer answer would be, I think there is a limit to how much the sector is working in that way. I think the reason for that would probably be that the risk of that and the innovation in that and the investment in that is not likely to come from the sector itself, from housing associations. They are unlikely to kind of invest in that technology themselves because of the nature of their operations is that they're, social purpose businesses, and that kind of risk and investment in potential technologies, I don't think that would sit with housing associations. I think that would have to move on almost outside of them, and then for them to adopt it. And I don't think it's got to that point for them to fully take on that risk.
I mean, I maybe being unfair asking you too much in this sector. I mean, we did get the impression once before that planning was resistant to kind of modern techniques. They like, you know, some of the planning departments like to keep areas, houses looking like they always looked like. Is that something you've picked up at all?
I don't know that specifically.
No,
I
okay,
can
that's fine.
go back. But
Excuse me. Thank you. Leslie?
Sorry, it was a different point, if I may, so just...
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted to go in the back of John.
No,
I'm okay.
Because I want to move on to the issue of capital, because we're about an hour in, we've got another half an hour or so to go, and I don't want to, I want to try and move on if we can. So apologies there, but everyone will have an opportunity to sum up at the end, so if there's anything that we've missed out or you feel we haven't covered, we can touch on then. So back to yourself, Elaine, in your submission you say a low level of capital to support work is a key cause of the UK's relatively low labour productivity. And you go on to say it would take almost a century to catch up with capital intensive high productivity peer countries. Quite a depressing prospect. You said even if the UK was able to increase its investment rate by about 4 points, that's how long it would take. Now, you say that the UK has firm-level barriers, including risk aversion, investment constraints and cultural issues. So what are those constraints and how do we overcome them?
That's what I'm trying to figure out. So when we look at the performance, if we look at Scotland's performance rather than the UK
Well, I have to say Germany's economy has been stagnating for 5 years, by the way.
It has been. It's having a tougher time. Yeah, I shouldn't say an upside to that at all. The economic performance of Scotland, if you compare it, if we use the OECD as a comparator to that, Scotland's levels of capital investment are second from bottom in the OECD countries when it comes to capital investment by business. So something like 40% of businesses in Scotland don't carry any debt. And I don't know, Stacey will have some thoughts from the SME space that sit within that. Is that a problem? Well, it is a problem because their buildings are not well capitalised. Their businesses are not making advances in the things that they need to make advance of. They're not taking on board the new energy-intensive but advantageous opportunity, etc., etc. So the lack of willingness to take on capital by business is increasingly becoming more of a problem. And the counter to that is when we look at the well-performing economies, you see that the better invested businesses do have higher levels of productivity and do have better paid employees that I referred to earlier on. So there needs to be something to try and balance some of this along the way. The approach that we're taking, and it's just one approach to it, is got 3 prongs within it. So one of them is the attraction of new money that comes into the economy. It's to see what could those big strategic propositions for Scotland be that are going to put us on the map for the future. So whether that's around data capabilities or aerospace capabilities or whatever it happens to be, how do you bring new money into the economy from out with? The second one is the work that we do generally with business. So how do you get businesses to do that? So why would a business invest in its capital? It has to really be looking more at its market, at its exports, at its innovation capability, all the things that you would expect a business to be doing, but most of them kind of don't really. They're just so caught up in the business of doing the business, except for some of the bigger ones that we have. And the third area within that is the way we work with the commercial property market, and this actually comes back not specifically to housing, but to the links round about planning and the way in which infrastructure development is taken forward, because Scotland's industrial capability is, has aged very poorly when you look at other countries, and that really needs to be brought up to speed. But developers will not do that speculative build for high-spec industrial capabilities.
I mean, one of the things clearly is current political and economic instability. I mean, the economy, UK economy is flatlining, etc. And there is a lot of turbulence in the political situation. So maybe people are afraid to invest. That tends to be the kind of situation. But if we actually look at the benefits of capital, you've talked about a permanent increase in the economic infrastructure, a rate of 1% of national income permanently raises GDP by around 4.9%. And for social infrastructure such as housing, health and prisons, 3.5%. There's obviously a balance to be struck between those two, but both of them are extremely positive. And yet Scotland, although it's had a huge increase in capital allocation this year, it will decline over the next 4 or 5 years, so that it's going to be where we were a couple of years back. So there's not really any major advance in terms of catching up on international competitors, as you suggested. So how does how does the Scottish Government tackle that, given the kind of restrictions on capital that we have as part of the fiscal framework?
So I don't know how Scottish Government tackles it. I only know how...
It's more or less the UK decides a capital, more or less.
Yeah, sorry, I simply mean I can't speak on behalf of Scottish Government in the answers that I'm given.
No, I'm suggesting what you think they should do with the resources they have. I'm not asking to...
Yeah, sorry, apologies. So there's two sides to it. So there's public sector spend on capital projects, so things like housing, things like transport, things like roads, etc. There needs to be a level of stability and assurance that comes round about these things. It's the consistent thing. You absolutely hit the nail on the head. Just the changes that take place across economies. People put off their investment decisions, so that happens both within the public sector and within the private sector. My focus tends to be more on the private sector rather than public in this space. So the changing in inflation, the cost pressures, all these normal things that come through. But we hear a lot from businesses who will say that economic instability from different policies, different regulatory changes that come through, we don't have any kind of advance warning of something new that's coming in a significant period of time. All of these things make it very difficult for them to calculate the return on investment with changing input costs that are coming in at them.
Michael, to be followed by Craig.
Just not sure I buy that, if I'm honest. And the convener's point as well. I mean, the business and enterprise research and development expenditure, investment in business and capital has been in Scotland have been low for decades. I mean, it was the subject to the very first economic development policy under devolution, and those numbers really haven't shifted at all. So as much as I recognise the kind of current situation globally, you see what's happening in France and so on, in other countries as well, the challenges that people have, shifting in interest rates, political instability generally. I mean, I think we do need to look more fundamentally. I'm a little bit, I suppose, part of my analysis of that would be that we have a very high rate of foreign ownership of some of these companies in Scotland, that actually typically they won't invest in essentially satellite operations in other countries, but your solution seems to be more foreign investment rather than actually trying to find means by which we can capitalise domestic firms, find ways to make sure that we use our financial sector to try and make sure that we have the people taking on that investment and making longer term returns. I do understand the current challenge of some of that, but I'm just not sure in terms of the prescription that it feels all that current to me. I do have another part on capital, if that's okay, if I can come on.
No, sorry, we'll let Elaine answer that.
Yeah, so the investment, the attraction of investment that I'm talking about is not foreign direct investment in the sense of businesses setting up here. It's in the sense of, if I was to use a sovereign wealth fund as an example, pension funds that exist elsewhere, how do you attract those monies to come here to do things that help our economy as we move forward? The secondary bit on that, on foreign direct investors who come into Scotland, they actually invest really heavily. They make some of the biggest contributions that we see in terms of jobs, in terms of levels of R&D, in terms of better paid wages. So that's a really massively important bit to retain. It's actually in that SME base predominantly where we see a slower level of, and it's not that people are not ambitious, it's that willingness to take on the risk and to move forward. The supply of finance, particularly debt finance, is extremely high. It's not that there's no availability of money. It does come with guarantees that come with it, and that puts lots of people off from taking that money on to go and advance their business along the way. So I would probably disagree with you on the FDI component part
so
of it.
I'm certainly not opposed to FDI as an absolutely integral part of how we make sure that we've got a functioning economy, and we need the more of that, in essence, the better. I suppose it's that kind of longer term shape. I mean, and the shape of the economy, more higher number of SMEs in Scotland in comparison to other parts of the UK, smaller number of corporates, I think exposes that part of the challenge that you put as well. On my other part of capital, if that's okay, convener. So I want to speak to ask Andy about this. The submission from College of Scotland, I thought, was, it touches on some of the issues we were talking about, productivity, essentially through investment in IT, other areas. It doesn't really touch on the fact there's an £800 million backlog in maintenance alone for colleges in Scotland. And your ability to actually make the kind of transformations and changes that you're talking about. I would compare that in a little bit to our university sector and the challenges they have at the moment. Go to the West End of Glasgow and see the huge number of new buildings that are there. Is there a more fundamental challenge about, again, taking on debt, structuring the businesses? colleges just don't seem to have it. They don't have that option because they sit underneath the. But are you hearing any alternatives or ways the government's going to deal with these kind of issues? Because it sits with them.
Yes, so no, you raise a fair point about the level of backlog maintenance and lack of life cycle maintenance, which means the backlog gets worse and worse. And you know, I think Audit Scotland itself has a figure there of the shortfall to what was required in regard to that funding, and that is funding just to get buildings wind and watertight. This is just to provide a reasonable level of place for somebody to learn, not to have to be dancing around lots of red buckets, which happen in several campuses across Scotland. Yeah, there is a challenge around the funding vehicle for colleges in regard to capital, and work has been looked at by Scottish Futures Trust, and of all of the capital vehicles that are there, very few are available under the current setup for colleges to access. So it is very dependent on Scottish Government and traditional capital routes. So there is a piece of work. The SFC have got a college infrastructure strategy. One of the strands of that is looking at those funding vehicles, but we're keen to see that progress as fast as possible. I think in the funding element, again, there's a college's infrastructure investment plan, which again the SFC are taking forward. Again, we'd want to see that moving faster, because when Scotland's infrastructure investment plan is refreshed, we need to ensure that the college element is in it, and it's not really had that opportunity up to this point, because this is the first time we've had this comprehensive plan looking at what's needed across the college sector. This time, trying to not just deal with the wind and watertight issues, but what needs to happen to reach net zero targets by 2045, carbon neutral by 2038, trying to get that modern place for learners to be, because we've said skills is key for driving the economy. We need to then invest in the places and the technology to allow that to happen.
So we don't know what that infrastructure pipeline is going to look like, both in terms of how it's going to be laid out. Clearly, it'll be a list of projects in some regards, but I mean, with the best one, Laura Michelle Thompson's already touched on this. I think the level of capital investment, maybe the convener as well. The idea that there's going to be £800 million suddenly available for this in that pipeline, I think, is highly unlikely. Have you been making representations to the government you want to see a policy shift that might unlock capital possibilities for colleges that are beyond just a list of projects? Is that part of the conversation ahead of the pipeline?
It is, because I think there's a number of aspects to this, and laying out the capital need of the sector is clearly one of them. Looking at what funding vehicles could, what needs to change within the current legal structure of colleges to allow other capital funding vehicles to become available is a question we've asked. And I think there's elements around other projects going on, so the single Scottish estate work as well. I would say colleges are at the edge of that, not for want of wanting to be involved, but it tends to be central government buildings and property that seems to be focused at. But I think it would benefit from that wider look. Colleges are right across Scotland with buildings, so how can those be utilised? Co-location of resources and services from the public sector, given that colleges have properties all over Scotland, but they're also places the community know and are willing to cross the threshold to go into. So all of these elements we have been progressing in discussions, yes.
Okay, thank you, Andy.
Okay, I'll get 4 people keen to come in. So first will be Craig, followed by Leslie.
Elaine, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but obviously a lot of SMEs and other sectors like life sciences do report that raising capital and funds in Scotland is difficult. Amongst the Scottish public sector within local government, for example, there's £65 billion sitting in pension funds. Some of that actually ends up being invested in, for example, the life sciences industry in Australia through traditional investment pension portfolios. But there does seem to be a reluctance to invest in early stage investments, for example, in life sciences here in Scotland amongst public sector pensions, or there have been examples. For example, Strathclyde Pension Fund used a specialist venture capital fund to invest and did get a win-win, jobs into Strathclyde and also return on their investment. What more could be done both for public infrastructure but also for those funds seeking access to cash in Scotland to lean in perhaps more on public sector pensions? And what discussions have you had with governments or the funds to try and bring that culture about?
So it's a great example, Craig, of conversations that are taking place within Scottish Enterprise. We've got an area that focuses on early stage investment. Scottish National Investment Bank is the primary place for those conversations to be taking place, but we do have a role where we still support earlier stage entrepreneurs and young companies with scaling capability. It tends to be a seed level of funding up to a co-investment level that's taking place. So colleagues in that team have been engaging with local pension fund holders. That's a relatively new conversation to take place. It seems strange that it's a new conversation, but as a potential source, and there seems to be more of an appetite to do that. There's a bit of a disconnect. I mean, it sounds simplistic. There's a communication disconnect where certain forums of office seem to believe that someone else is taking something forward. Yeah. So the conversation that came up earlier on actually between education and economy as an example, we need to get much better at linking our conversations across the piece to understand the holders of those pension funds to be saying, well, where is the need in Scotland? But equally, we need to then be better at saying, where is the demand to service it? There is a vehicle, a portal, investment portal that's been created with support from Scottish Government at the current time. It will be hosted by Scottish Development International, but it's as much about accessing local funds as it is about overseas funds that are coming through. So not well enough to date would be my short answer on it, but conversations are taking place now, thinking about that front.
Thanks. And Stacey, just in terms of small businesses, the whole kind of concept of bootstrapping or small businesses borrowing from banks or from family members, remortgaging their houses and things and not finding perhaps slightly more sophisticated ways of raising funds. You get the impression that post-COVID the banks have been less open to that. Is that something that your members have picked up upon? And does that mean that they're simply, because quite a large number of small businesses are in higher levels of debt than they were pre-COVID, does that mean that we're in for quite a tough period in terms of investment into SMEs and small businesses?
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to come in to say. Elaine's right to say that small businesses are very reluctant to take on external finance, certainly post-COVID. So about 25% of the respondents to our survey told us that they tried to obtain external finance in the last year, and that's the same number as told us in 2023, so it's not increased. The personal guarantees, that the requirements around that is a big reason for small businesses not taking that on, but certainly post-COVID, those that are still paying off their loans obviously don't want to take on any more. I think a big issue for the majority of our members is that they often don't see themselves in some of the, the kind of enterprise agency fund and Scottish National Investment Bank. They don't see themselves, that's not an option for them to approach Scottish Enterprise because, when they look at, government strategies and priorities, it's unicorns, it's tech scalers, high growth companies, and which obviously we do need. Those are great companies to support, but I think our members often feel underlooked and maybe a wee bit underappreciated in terms of those who maybe just want to grow a bit more modestly, in terms of, they don't feel that they're maybe even prioritised, or when they do try and navigate that system, whether they have the capacity to navigate the system is one thing, but it's a very complex maze for them to navigate, and they just don't have the time to take that out of their business, to be honest with you, to try and obtain that finance.
I was going to come to you next, Stacey, because, you want to come in anyway and you come in on whatever you wish, but one of the things you've talked about is that you're keen to see an increased share of public contracts awarded to small local firms, and you found that while some barriers have been removed following the introduction of the Procurement Reform Scotland Act 2014, others persisted. What are those barriers?
Well, one of them is that just the ability to, the tender processes can be very intense. So if you're a sole trader, self-employed, trying to navigate that system while also still running your own business is too much of an ask, unfortunately. We commissioned some research earlier this year from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies to try and update some research that we'd done in 2012, which was looking at what share of spend was actually going to the kind of small micro businesses as part of the community wealth building legislation that's progressing through Parliament just now, and our main aim for that research was to try and get an idea of, by local authority, how much are you spending, in the last year we looked at, it's very difficult to actually get a picture of how much each local authority is spending each year, because there's local authorities are reporting it in different ways, they're disclosing it in different ways. We found that some are actually exempt from disclosing it altogether, even when FOI'd, so we couldn't actually get a true picture at the moment of how much is actually been spent with small and micro businesses. So what we're hoping that we're pushing for some amendments to this legislation to standardise the reporting requirements for local authorities. I don't understand why they would be reporting the same amount of spend in different ways to allow us to track that public money. It's important to be transparent. And if we set those reporting requirements, then I think we need to look at setting. We're doing well, you know, we're doing a lot better in terms of the proportion, but we can do better, and that requires targets.
I mean, one of the things you've said is that you would support the introduction of statutory targets and how much is spent by public bodies with small businesses each year, but I'm just wondering how that would work practically. I mean, because it may be that a public body doesn't have a small business that would produce a specific product. You know, I mean, for example, that they're required. So I'm just wondering what and how this aligns with making Scotland more competitive, generally speaking. I mean,
yeah, definitely. I mean, local authorities are never going to be able to, you know, they can't source their energy contracts from small businesses within the local community. We're certainly not asking, you know, it would be silly for us to say, yes, 75% of all spending by local authorities has to be with a business in the area. But, you know, part of the community wealth building pilots, local authorities like Clyde Manager set a target to increase their spending by, I think, 3%.
Yeah, North Ayrshire and Myre has done similar.
Yeah, those were in the pilots. So when they set those small incremental targets, they achieved them and in often cases went above and beyond. So it's about looking at, I think local authorities are committed to this, the concept of community wealth building and doing better. Let's set some targets to kind of focus the mind and increase it by 1%, 2% every year.
I mean, I think all else being equal, people do want to buy locally, but if it's 20% more expensive, then that's obviously, you know, public money that could be better spent somewhere else in a company that might be more efficiently and effectively run 25 miles up the road, you know?
Yes, quite. But yeah, I mean, we're also looking at not just within the local authorities. Obviously, some local authorities are very small, looking at it on a region kind of basis, local authorities working together. There's certainly scope. You know, obviously, local authorities have to be conscious of price, but I think there's certainly scope for them to be doing more there, and targets tend to focus the mind.
Price, quality and delivery, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Right price, the right quality, delivered on time. If only, Okay, Leslie.
Come back quickly on Michael's question about estates, because it is an issue also for universities. We have an extremely diverse estate, from kind of grade A listed 1960s horrors, modern facilities, and I think you are seeing the universities that are able to invest, for example, through debt, investing in the improvement and development of their estates. You mentioned Glasgow. It's obviously a key part of the attractiveness of our institutions that they have modern teaching and research facilities, but we do also have significant issues with backlog of maintenance in some of those older buildings. So it's approximately £850 million to bring all of the university facilities that are currently categorised as category C or D, so that's beyond kind of intended lifespan, up to category B that is satisfactory. We're certainly not looking for public sector grant funding to fill that space at the moment. The majority of capital funding that comes into universities is afforded for research. We do get about £5 million a year from the Scottish Government for estates, but relative obviously to that gap, that's a very small amount. We're really keen to have a conversation about affordable borrowing, and for some of those institutions that might not have the ability to pay market interest rates at the moment that you know, other institutions may be able to. So in the past, universities have been able to borrow financial transactions money when it's sat with the Scottish Funding Council at a very, very low interest rate. Those FTs were moved to capitalise SNIB. It's entirely understandable, but of course SNIB is mandated to lend at commercial interest rates. So we have a very constructive relationship with SNIB and an ongoing conversation, but really keen to have that engagement with the Scottish Government to say, is there a space where universities could potentially access some loan funding to deal with some of these estate issues, especially where you have facilities that are shared with the community, and that we may look at kind of saying, is there a longer term borrowing opportunity that we could look to kind of leverage into the sector?
I think that's really useful. in terms of the diversity of the sector. I reflect that it's probably not a diversity that's available to the college sector, but I recognise there are challenges within universities. I mean, the Scottish Government approved the mutual investment model back in 2019, the MIM, and it doesn't appear to have been used at all, whereas in Wales it's been used to build, I think, 30 schools and colleges, and this really is a policy question as to whether the Scottish Government decide to use it or not. It's my understanding that there are investors that are actively open to work in that kind of area. Dundee and Angus College is one example that's close to home for me. But is there any indication that you've had, Leslie and Andy, that for instance, the MIM, is that something that's been used, or maybe Leslie, or that might be available?
Well, I'm going to let Leslie in and respond to that, and then I'm going to go to Tom and Michelle, and then after that we're going to have to go to wind-up points because time is against us. We're already just about out of time. So if Leslie, if you could respond to that, and then I'll turn to yourself, Tom, because you're the only paper I haven't referenced yet, and I want to ask you something about that. And then Michelle will be the last person to contribute, and then I'll give all 5 of our guests an opportunity to say any final points they may wish to. Andy will be the last to speak because you were the first to speak when we started. Okay,
so
Leslie.
Quickly, thank you, Convener. I've never heard of that MIM, so I'll go and ask sector and state colleagues and come back to you.
Yes, Tom, I mean, you've basically said in your response in terms of capital that investment in the affordable housing supply programme should be a priority of the Scottish Government capital spend. Now, you've said following that crucially government grant in Scotland is still around 50%, which should not be altered through capital spend plans. Any changes to that ratio? I've seen in England where grant has been as low as 15% in recent years, risks pushing rents up. Is there any? Have you heard anything that the Scottish Government is planning to reduce the grant from 50% at all? Is that something that you've heard, or is it just something you wish to flag up at this point?
I think no concrete plans. There was just a lot of talk around the time of the Housing Investment Task Force about additional private investment, and there wasn't really clarity on actually what that meant. And so I think we were concerned that there was a potential looking at the balance of grant levels. And so even in the Housing Emergency Action Plan, that 4.9 billion over 4 years, we don't know what the balance of that is. And we don't know whether that is 4.9 billion of public money or 4.9 billion in some way balanced between public and private money. We would urge that to be public money because then the housing associations can borrow on top of that. So in terms of leveraging private finance, that's what housing associations do. So in the last Parliament, there's 3.5 billion investment in the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. The total spend on that was over 7 billion, so they doubled it. And that's off the public sector balance sheet as well. So we don't know of any concrete plans to change the grant level, but we would urge it to stay at that level.
Right, so you're just basically putting out a marker there just to express concerns on that. Okay, yeah. That's fine. Okay, Michelle.
Just very briefly, I think to make a point explicit that's been implicit in some of these discussions around access to finance. We've had commentary which I think is very valid about SMEs, and PGs are hugely prohibitive and carrying C-bills and bounce-back loans and so on. And obviously in terms of the college sector being able to, under this current structure, to be able to access funds, your comment about FTs via SNIB, and I just think it might be worthwhile us making a marker that looking at different sectors and access to finance is deeply constrained when we link it to the economic multipliers that you've commented, particularly around housing. And it's just thinking about it a slightly different way.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, as I said, everyone's going to have an opportunity to say anything they feel we haven't touched on or they want to re-emphasise from what was spoken about earlier. Andy will go last, so I'm just looking for volunteers. Otherwise, I'll just pick somebody. Anyone want to? Yes, Leslie, well volunteered.
Thank you, Convener. Just very quickly to come back on Michelle's point about international students, and you were saying about if it was a business you would kind of looked at it, completely take that point. I think the point is that universities are receiving about £3,000 less per Scottish student now than they were getting in 2014. The only source of income that's big enough to deal with that has been international students. We have diversified in terms of markets, and not to be over-reliant on 1 or 2 countries, for example. It's expensive to go into new markets because it's so hyper-competitive internationally, and some of the visa changes recently have actually pushed you away from diversification because we're really hemmed in by very, very tight rules around visa refusals. The other model is, of course, what we call transnational education, or TNE, you might have heard of, which is like campuses overseas. Another good way of bringing in a form of income without actually bringing the students into the UK. Again, it's expensive, it's long term. We see some universities already well established in that area, for example, Heriot Watt, and others kind of looking to build on that, but we do, that takes time. And I think where you see the current crisis that we're in, that's probably the point that I would end on, really, Convener, is the point that Michael was drawing out earlier about there are changes that need to be made within the sector. We're up for those changes. Some of them take longer than others, but in the meantime, it's that stabilising financial settlement that just gives us that little bit of breathing space to then look to the future to say, what is it that we want from the sector going forward, and how is it we're going to deliver it? And to come back to Ross's point, what are the changes that needs to be made from everybody involved in that system in order to make it successful in future?
Okay, who wants to go next? Elaine?
Happy to come in. I think 2 points that I would probably like to leave is encouragement across the different considerations that you'll be making going forward, to think about that alignment across different departments and how we really get a lot more synergy, because there's lots of opportunities in there that are undoubtedly being missed just from the lack of interconnectedness between some of them. The second one that I would share, because I've got oversight of something called a business support partnership, it's 39 public sector organisations that provide support to business, and we publish that information on a flat content website called Find Business Support. There's over 100 publicly funded organisations who are defraying support to business at the current time. I don't believe that's the optimal model for the future. The cost to serve associated with that is particularly high. It makes it more complex for business to understand who to go to for which support, point that Stacey made, at any point in time, and it probably costs more to deliver than that's actually reaching businesses at the other side. So again, it's about thinking to the future rather than thinking about the here and now. Let's get those models right.
Okay, thank you very much. Stacey?
I would probably like to just stress the importance of adequate impact assessment by government of all policy and regulations it brings forward. We did a lot of work as part of the New Deal for Business group, look at revising the business and regulatory impact assessment, the BRIA, to better account for the impact of policies and regulations on small businesses. We've seen some recent issues where there wasn't adequate impact assessment done of VAT implications on small businesses with the visitor levy, for example, which we're now dealing with the consequences of that and through the implementation of those schemes. It's currently optional, although highly encouraged, but we would like to see it become mandatory, to be honest. We're still seeing some consultations being published without even partial BRIAs, so it's not fully assessing the impact on small businesses, which the impact on small businesses are often very different to business at large, so it's important that we're doing that impact assessment more thoroughly.
Okay, thank you for that. Tom?
I think I just want to highlight how housing, and specifically affordable housing, cuts across the Scottish Government's priorities and in the medium-term financial strategies, those first two pillars especially, and I guess specifically on the fiscal sustainability challenge, which one thing we've not quite touched on, is health spending is rising with the ageing population, but housing is such an important social determinant of health. And if you can invest in housing, and that is at the more kind of acute level of homelessness and where that spend ends up in the health system, but then also more kind of general housing, accessibility, energy efficiency, space and the neighbourhoods that people live in. So in terms of trying to save money elsewhere in the healthcare system and for the overall Scottish budget, housing is going to be a really important part of that.
Yeah, you touched on adaptations, for example, you
Yeah,
know, and
yeah.
you know how small investments there could make a big difference.
Yeah, exactly. And then the second point is that housing is a massive enabler of economic growth. And I think that's probably been underappreciated, and especially in certain parts of the country where there is a real lack of affordable homes. And it's not just the skills shortage, it's the investment in the homes, the maintenance of the homes. And I mean, I defer, Duncan McLennan is like the authority on this. He's working on this, and he had one paper out recently with the David Hume Institute, and there's another paper coming, and I think that would be a good place to look as well, because I don't think you're not going to achieve the economic growth and everything that comes with that and in an inclusive way as well, that kind of like includes people and is people have an affordable place to live and contribute to the economy without that investment in affordable housing.
Okay, thank you very much. And last but not least, Mr Whitty.
Thanks, Convener. I suppose just to leave a thought about looking forward related to the public service reform strategy, and I think it's important for the Scottish Government to lay out how it will change the public service delivery model in response to that. And what I mean is we need to start with what is needed to support Scottish Government objectives, be it reducing child poverty, climate, the unsustainable skills model that we've looked at this morning. And it's about how each portfolio spend aligns to those priorities, not just the priorities within its own siloed portfolio, but actually how do we get that true cross-portfolio prioritisation of spend to support the objectives of the government. And I suppose the thought of the ask is what would be beneficial to that is to have an agreed streamlined process across all different government departments of how that would work and how that would be done, because that doesn't exist at the moment, and I think that would be helpful.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I want to thank all our guests this morning for your very helpful contributions to our deliberations. We will continue to take evidence on this over the next few weeks, because fiscal sustainability and long-term fiscal pressures is something that's always on the minds of members of the committee. So without further ado, I'd like to call a break until 11:10 to enable a changeover of witnesses and a natural break for members. Continue our evidence taking on pre-budget scrutiny, this time with a focus on social security within the context of fiscal sustainability. For the second panel, we are joined by Shirley Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Ian Davidson, Deputy Director, Social Security Policy, James Wallace, Deputy Director, Social Justice Finance Lead, Scottish Government, and David Wallace, Chief Executive, Social Security Scotland. Good morning and welcome to the meeting. And I'd like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement. Cabinet.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Convener. Let me say at the outset that our benefit expenditure is essential investment in the people of Scotland and directly results from conscious policy choices made by this Parliament in accordance with the unanimously passed 2018 Social Security Scotland Act. Investing in this way in Scotland's social security safety net, targeting help to those who need it most, is necessary to tackle over a decade of Westminster austerity and continued cruel welfare reforms. The Scottish Government continues to deliver vital assistance for older people to heat their homes and to help disabled people live independent lives and to support low-income families. Our social security system is proudly based on dignity, fairness and respect. It is fair, but it is robust, with applications assessed thoroughly so that those who are not eligible for support do not get it, but those who are eligible absolutely do. We are committed to ensuring finances remain on a sustainable trajectory. This financial year, we are investing £1.2 billion more than the block grant adjustments we are forecast to receive from the UK Government for Social Security, of which £649 million is to mitigate some of the worst impacts of Westminster policies, for example, the bedroom tax and the benefits cap, as well as the inadequate level of universal credit, for which we have established the Scottish Child Payment to combat. By 29-30, our additional investment is projected to be just less than 3.5% of the total Scottish Government resource budget, an increase of less than 1% compared to the current financial year. The importance of value for money for our benefits investment is set out in the 2018 Social Security Act and is further underlined in our Social Security Charter. It means, for example, we are delivering £1.4 billion paid to June 2025, supporting children and families through the 5 family payments, including the Scottish Child Payment. This support is only available in Scotland. It also means, for instance, more than £5.5 billion this financial year to support disabled people to meet the costs associated with the everyday tasks such as washing, going to the toilet and getting dressed, tasks which people who are not disabled take for granted. Of course, this stands in direct contrast to proposed Westminster welfare reforms. The UK Government's chaotic approach to welfare continues to cause substantial and unnecessary difficulties, such as the intention to introduce a 2-tiered universal credit system, leaving people with disabilities or long-term health conditions with less money compared to existing recipients. These changes, I have been clear that this Government does not support and will not accept, and we would encourage and urge the UK Government to drop those remaining plans. By contrast, our Scottish Child Payment, whose impact has been described by Professor Danny Dorling of the University of Oxford as stunning, is estimated to keep 40,000 children out of relative poverty this year. And it's no surprise, Convener, that so many leading charities have rightly called on the UK Government to follow our lead on the Scottish Child Payment, which could, according to the London School of Economics, lift 700,000 children in the UK out of poverty overnight, as well as to follow our lead on abolishing the punitive 2-child limit, where our modelling estimates our action will result in 20,000 fewer children living in relative poverty in 26-27. On fraud and error, the Scottish Public Finance Manual sets out clear expectations for managing fraud risk. It requires public bodies to promote an anti-fraud culture, maintain strong internal controls and actively minimise risk. Social Security Scotland has published a counter-fraud strategy that outlines its approach to preventing, detecting and responding to fraud. This is especially important given the nature of its work, delivering public benefits with dignity, fairness and respect. Protecting the integrity of these benefits is essential, not only for financial sustainability, but also to maintain public trust in the system. The organisation's approach is grounded in zero tolerance, but also proportionate, ensuring robust controls without creating unnecessary barriers for clients. and balancing sustainability with our overarching ethos and principles is why I could not recommend legislative consent for some of the overpayment recovery measures within the UK Government's current bill. As delivery expands to 19 benefits by 26-27, the risk of fraud naturally increases. Social Security Scotland has made strong progress in building the systems and capabilities to manage this effectively. Continued investment in technology, skilled people and robust systems will be essential, and what has worked well to date must now be scaled and strengthened to, of course, meet the future demands. Convener, in conclusion, our social security investment is making a real difference in people's lives. The children I've mentioned who are being kept out of relative poverty, the 5 family payments I've mentioned worth around £25,000 by the time a child turns 16. Just another example of why the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and other projects in Scotland will be the only part of the UK with falling child poverty levels next year. With a backdrop of austerity and a continued cost of living crisis, we know how critical support is for households. That's why the Scottish Government is protecting the vital payments available today. Labour and the Conservatives, along with Reform, talk about cutting welfare spend with no regard to the financial struggles that many households face. So the Scottish Government will continue to deliver our vital payments with our balanced budget each year, delivered by a system which is robust but fair and administered to provide support to all our constituents. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much for that very bold and helpful opening statement. I'm actually delighted you're here this morning because we've discussed social security ad infinitum over the years on this committee, but it's always really been through a finance secretary rather than yourself or indeed your predecessors who've been directly responsible for it. The catalyst, obviously, for inviting you here this morning, obviously, was the article in the Scotsman about the £36 million which allegedly the Scottish Government is not pursuing, and that did cause considerable concern among members of the committee. So, for example, there was a Freedom of Information. Through Freedom of Information, a Scottish Government spokeswoman was quoted as saying, and I quote, the Scottish social security system is focused on treating with fairness, dignity and respect. Scottish Ministers have been clear they cannot support UK Government proposals to take powers to recover directly from an individual's bank accounts without requiring a court order or to potentially suspend driving licence. And it suggested that although there was no hole in the Scottish budget, there was no elaboration on where the money would be found to write off the £36 million in alleged fraud and overpayments. So clearly that would be £36 million lost to the Scottish Government if it was not recovered. So what is the Scottish Government doing to try and ensure that that money... Well, first of all, you talked about fraud methods, but so how are we ensuring that fraud is minimised? And secondly, what is being done to restore that money to the Scottish budget?
Thank you, Convener. And I very much welcome what is my first time in front of the Finance Committee. I'll see whether I still hold that view at the end of the session as well. But it is a pleasure to be able to come and give evidence today. I'll perhaps bring in David Wallace, who can talk through the operational matters about where there is a very serious concerted effort within the agency at the moment for the benefits we are responsible for. But in relation to the item that was in the newspapers, I think it was particularly disappointing about the way that that was portrayed because, one, there is no black hole in the Scottish Government budget, and certainly the Scottish Government takes very seriously our responsibilities to ensure that we have very, very firm policies both for overpayments, of which fraud is one part of that. The reason why we as a government looked very seriously at whether we should take part in some of the aspects of the fraud and error bill is because I was concerned about, for example, the ability to take money away from people's bank accounts without due notice and consideration of their current circumstances. That's a concern for me because that is not a person-centred approach, because it doesn't take account of the impacts on that individual. The other aspect around, for example, taking away driving licences, we all have areas in our constituencies, and I'm sure constituents, where we can imagine the taking away of a driving licence does not help you to get a job. It does not help you to allow to be able to take your children to childcare, for example. So the impact of that on an individual I think, is punitive in a way which does not help them get a job, get employment, get into education or training, or to be able to assist wider family issues. So that's an area, a type of measure which I was greatly concerned with. Now, that's a tactic of how you deal with overpayments, which I did not agree with. The important aspect, though, is our absolute determination to have strong and robust policies for overpayments, including fraud, but it just will not be through the methods which the UK government were suggesting. Now, we did have a great deal of back and forth with the UK government about whether we could continue working on historical debt, and that, again, this is just about historical debt that's been built up, and we were unable to do so, which is why I declined further cooperation on that part of the bill. And we will move forward to how we deal with that in a way that fits the ethos of the social security system up here, but is, as I said in my initial statement, still very robust. But I'm happy to bring in David Wallace if you would like further information about how we deal with overpayments, fraud of which being one of those.
Yes.
So, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'll say a little bit about operationally what we do at the moment within the agency, and obviously that excludes the figure that's being talked about at the moment. So, just to emphasise a point the Cabinet Secretary has made, overpayments can occur through either error or fraud. In terms of overpayments themselves, we have a recovery system which is built on fairness, dignity and respect, and that is built into the ethos of how we do that. So we will always seek to try and do a voluntary recovery, and we've got a number of methods of trying to do that. We will always ensure that we're only seeking money which doesn't put people into financial hardship, so that's very much part of the recoveries team's work around about that. All of our recovery teams, for example, have been trauma trained so that they know they're dealing with potentially vulnerable people. And all of these sort of things point towards trying to recover any money that's been paid. I should also emphasise as well, if error has occurred because of an official mistake, official error, which the client couldn't reasonably have been liable for, we would also write off that debt as well. So I would just separate slightly the process around about recovery of overpayments and then fraud to the other side of it. On fraud itself, the organisation has a really robust sort of counter-fraud strategy the Cabinet Secretary referred to as well. And we've also been developing deep expertise and capability within the organisation. We're always a little bit careful about what we expose publicly around about that capability, but we have built teams from across other organisations who've dealt with fraud in the past. We also have surveillance powers as well, which again we have got a number of safeguards around how we use those surveillance powers as well. But we're building that capacity and that capability. We have a zero approach to fraud, and we will always tackle and investigate fraud reports as well.
Okay, I'm not going to pursue this any further because there's a number of issues I want to cover, but I'm sure colleagues will want to come in and explore this matter further. I mean, one of the things you said in your opening statement, Cabinet Secretary, was that you talked about £649 million of mitigation of UK austerity. Now, that's £649 million. If it's mitigating UK austerity, it's money that's not been spent on devolved services. Clearly now, we heard earlier on, just this morning, some concerns raised by the college sector, for example. I mean, £649 million is roughly their budget for the year, and you'll be aware that it's been cut by 17% in real terms over the last 5 years. So I think the issue in terms of poverty is surely one of opportunity cost. What the colleges would argue, and have argued robustly, is that if you're investing in skills, in training and employability, as opposed to, for example, larger benefit payments, that ultimately has greater benefits for the individual themselves and the economy and society, and makes Scotland actually more fiscally sustainable. So it's the opportunity cost argument, is it not, that is one of the big issues that we have to face at this time when, although you've said there's not a black hole, the funding gap that the government faces is around £1 billion for the next financial year and £2.6 billion by 29-30.
Thank you, Convener. So there is, with all budget decisions right across government, an opportunity cost about making one decision over the alternatives that are there. If I can give one example that we are currently dealing with, is the mitigation of the two-child cap. So there is clearly the figures that I discussed in my opening statements are around current mitigation, but we will very much expect the level of mitigation costs to go up as we mitigate the two-child cap. The First Minister has made it very clear that if the UK Government, in its child poverty strategy, which we now think will be at the end of the year after the budget, but that timing is of course up to the UK Government. If the UK Government were to include in that the mitigation or the scrapping of the two-child caps we no longer had to mitigate, we would use that money on further anti-poverty measures for children. So that's one example of the opportunity cost of
but when you're talking about anti-poverty measures, is investing in colleges, is investing in local government, is investing in a university sector, are they not ultimately anti-poverty measures which allow people, to do more with their lives than, for example, having additional money being spent on benefits?
Well, indeed, and that takes me to my next point, Convener, which is the very important part as we look at the child poverty delivery plans of social security being one aspect of assisting people with poverty, but only one aspect of that. So the others, as you know, Convener, are around ensuring well-paid employment. Of course, part of education and training is an important part to be able to allow people to take part in that. So as we deal with poverty, there are different ways of dealing with poverty. Social security is a very important one, and I think some of the evidence that came to this committee and others shows it is making an impact. But there are other ways where we can tackle anti-poverty, where we can tackle poverty. That's why the Child Poverty Delivery Plan has different legs to that stool. Employment's one of that, and the way into employment through education is clearly a very important way to do that. It ties into those wider opportunity costs that we have within government.
OK, but for example, University of Scotland told us that the Flexible Workforce Development Fund, valued at £10.5 million a year, was discontinued in 23-24, and the Open University had to turn over away 1,000 learners. I imagine many of them would have been from disadvantaged communities, and the Scottish Funding Council's Upskilling Fund, previously valued at £7 million, was also discontinued last year. Now, these are measures that have been taken to save money here and there, and yet additional funding is going into, as you pointed out in your opening statement, at least 1.2 billion, 1.3 billion, the Scottish Fiscal Commission will say, over and above devolved benefits. But the 1.3 billion is coming out of other areas. Local government tell me that they're having to cut virtually all non-statutory services, including support for people, with debt, for example, for people who are unemployed, childcare facilities. So it's not as if the money that the Scottish Government is investing in welfare is over and above. It's being taken from these other services. So therefore, what's happening is, because of the emphasis on welfare, other areas are being denuded of resources that they feel are essential to get people out of poverty. That's the irony of it. What analysis is being done, because the Scottish Government keeps talking about welfare being an investment in people, to compare the outcomes for people receiving higher benefits as opposed to the outcomes of people where you're investing in employability or college places or university?
So I absolutely take the point, Convener, that there are different measures that can be taken right across government to alleviate poverty. And yes, there are choices that have been made across government on this. I would say it's choices that have also been made across Parliament, because with very few exceptions, the delivery through the secondary legislation on the eligibility methods for social security have been supported on a cross-party cross-party basis. So these are proposals from the Scottish Government that have been supported with very few exceptions on a cross-party basis. So these are conscious choices that we have taken to have the eligibility that we have for different benefits, or indeed to have benefits that are only in Scotland that are not elsewhere. So I absolutely do take that point. On the issue around evaluation, there are a number of different evaluation measures that we have in place. If I can point to one in particular, which was a report by the Chief Social Policy Advisor last year, which looked at the evidence from Social Security Scotland about achieving a fairer Scotland through reducing poverty, household poverty, material deprivation and debt, and health and well-being. And that report by Professor Lindbald did look at the impact of social security payments and the impact that it has on individuals. So there's a very important work that we have to do as a government about looking at where the payments are going and the impact they are having on individuals. Now, that doesn't mean to say that that money can't be spent in different ways across government, but as part of social security, we're very keen to look at the impact it does make.
So I think everyone would agree that these payments will make people's life less awful if you're on benefits, because more money always does. But how does it lift people out of poverty in terms of having a different kind of life, you know, a life where they will be in employment and be able to look after themselves that way and not be dependent on benefits? I think that's where we're actually going now. In terms of the two-child cap, one of the issues of concern that I understand COSA raised a couple of weeks ago, and I raised this with the Finance Secretary, who said that there was discussions ongoing with the UK Government. Now, obviously the Scottish Government signalled that this policy change a considerable number of months ago. The Labour Party said they would only split the budget if we actually brought in the two-child cap in this financial year. I think, to be honest, that was a bit cadology there, frankly. But if that is the case, then why are discussions still ongoing about whether or not housing benefit, for example, and council tax benefit will be impacted by the two-child cap? In other words, if we give additional resources through two-child caps on families, it means they will no longer be eligible. So has that been sorted now? Because 2 weeks ago, my understanding was that the matter was still under discussion.
So happy to bring in Ian Davidson for some of the further detail on this, but convener, those good discussions start immediately, and we're certainly content that we've looked at the issue that COSLA has raised, and there are no issues that we foresee at present. But Ian can give further detail if you wish on that.
Yes, so in relation to reserved benefits, there's never been an issue. I think COSLA, I'm not quite sure where COSLA had got that from. The discussions with the UK Government have been clear that this new benefit will be disregarded for those purposes, and they will be bringing forward the legislation through the normal route of Section 104 order to make the necessary changes to UK legislation. But it's never been a bone of contention with the UK Government.
Well, thank you for clearing that up, because my understanding, as I said, from evidence taken 2 weeks ago, was that this matter was still under discussion, and COSA seemed to think that, so I'm glad you put that on the record today. I think that clarifies a really important point. Can I just talk about childcare for a second, because one of, I think, the great achievements of the SNP government has been an increase in childcare. It was 412 hours means tested. When the SNP came in, it's now 1,140 hours for 3- and 4-year-olds. I think that's a big achievement. I think it's been better resourced in down south, where there's real staffing issues and funding issues. But there are some advantages, it seems to me, in the system down south. And one of them is the fact that working parents can get support for 9 months. But in Scotland, we have that from 2 years. And it seems to be that if you have an income of over £850 a month, you do not get that childcare. So basically, mothers who are working don't get support with childcare, but mothers who are not working in Scotland do. So that's the reverse of the position in England. Now, how is that going to persuade women who are into work if they lose childcare by going into a job? And understand 20 hours a week is the threshold, as well as £850 a month. That seems to me that trapping people in poverty as opposed to encourage people into employment.
So if I can perhaps respond to the committee in writing with further detail on that, as childcare is not within my portfolio. But overall, I think one of the aspects that we do need to also take account of as we look at childcare is the importance of having an offer that is available to those in and out of work, because it's not just about providing childcare to get people into employment, it's about supporting those young children. And that is an important aspect that should not just be available necessarily to those that are in work. So it's about early learning as well as somewhere for people to go. There are, of course, issues around what's happening in the expansion down south, which show about the importance of ensuring the staffing levels and the supply is adequate to be able to deal with that. But again, Convener, you raise an important point about when we're looking at poverty, it's not just about social security. One of the recent visits I undertook was particularly to speak to young mums who are getting support not just in income maximisation, but also then on looking at the barriers to employability, whether it's around childcare, the types of childcare they require, and what that also has to match into the support they're getting from the wider system. If I can also point to the fact that there's a great deal of people that are in in-work poverty, so the getting off a job is not necessarily a route out of poverty for many, particularly women, but not just young women. So it is important that we look at providing people with support, even if they are in employment, if that work does not lift them out of poverty.
Yeah, I mean, 57% of people you know, in universal credit are in work, for example. So I think that's a point well made. But yes, 3- and 4-year-olds are not means tested, but 2-year-olds are. And it seems to be that if you're in work, well, it is the fact that if you're in work, you don't get free childcare. But if you're not in work, you do. It seems to me the exact opposite of how it should be. And in fact, the opposite of what it is in England. You know, so where's the incentive for people to actually say, well, you know, if I get myself a job, and if you've been unemployed for a long time, it's not going to be necessarily a well-paid job, and you end up with that kind of, you know, poverty trap whereby over a certain threshold you lose benefits. So therefore there's a real disincentive for people. This is the crux of the matter. It's not just about providing benefits to a certain level. It's about getting people to change the lives that they live so that they realise the opportunities that may be available to them. And I'm struggling to see how, you know, giving people who don't work childcare while denying it to people who do work is in any way positive.
Well, I think that, as again, I'm happy to provide further information about the eligibility for 2-year-olds. It's not to do with being out of work per se. The terminology which was previously
vulnerable
used was
around
vulnerable 2-year-olds. So it is about allowing those families who would benefit from additional support to have that additional support for that young person. But still got a
cash threshold of £850 a month.
Because we know that one of the important aspects around childcare and others is around preventative spend. So how to make that generational change in young people's lives is around the impact that we can make in the earliest of years. And that's why the vulnerable twos, we now talk about eligible twos for early learning and childcare, but it's that type of preventative spend that is an important part of the work we do to improve our longer term rates and systemic change within poverty as well.
Okay, now just one final question from me because colleagues are keen to come in. You know, the Scottish Fiscal Commission said, or rather Spice I should say, have said that over the next 5 years the amount spent in social security resource budget will increase as a share of the Scottish budget from 14% to 20%, from 6,332 million to 8,684 million. Now, I think we all appreciate that's demand-led, although within 5 years the decisions made by the Scottish Government will have added 1.5 billion to that total Scottish Child Payment and other things, as have already been mentioned. So Given that the Scottish budget is not particularly likely to grow much, maybe at 1% if we're lucky in real terms, and we've got CPI, Consumer Price Index inflation going into welfare payments, but the GDP deflator tends to be what's involved in our resource budget. How do we manage to continue to afford an effective welfare system without impacting on every other area of the Scottish Government, whether it's justice, we've got 800 fewer policemen than we had 5 years ago, whether it's NHS, whether it's joint integrated boards who are all chronically in debt at the moment, whereas it's universities who are struggling, colleges, etc. It appears to be squeezing out other areas of expenditure, and that ultimately has an impact on the Scottish economy, growth, the tax base and the ability of the Scottish economy to employ people who are currently in poverty.
So as I said in my opening remarks, Convener, we do recognise that by 29-30 our additional investment is projected to be around 3.5% of the total Scottish Government resource budget. Now, that is an increase of less than 1% compared to the current year, but yes, that is an increase. And what
Sorry,
we then...
I don't recognise these figures. I mean, what Spice and the Scottish Fiscal Commission have said is that it's going to go from about 6.33 to 8.7 billion.
So what I'm talking about there is the additional investment that we're making. So that's what we
so
invest above BGA, the block grant adjustment. So,
oh, right. So right, okay.
So
right,
those are the decisions that in effect add pressure.
Yeah. So basically, sorry. So you basically said that at the moment the Scottish Government it's about 1.2 billion over and above the block grant adjustment.
Yeah.
Or 1.3. The Scottish Fiscal Commission will say that's going to go up to 1.5.
Yes, so that will be an increase, and I absolutely recognise that. And this comes down to the crux of the matter in essence, Convener. There is a projected increase both in terms of our additional investment above BGA, and there is a projected rise on overall social security expenditure for reasons that will impact not just in Scotland but in the rest of the UK and are therefore covered by BGA. We then get down to why those numbers are going up and also if there is a demand or a call for those numbers to go down. In essence, what people are asking for is changes to the current eligibility that we have in our benefits. So what changes would people wish to make to the benefits to carers, the low income? Because that's the only way that trajectory changes.
Hold on, not necessarily. So adult disability payments are projected to go up from 3.6 to 5.4 billion, and the number of claimants in Scotland from 529,000 to 703,000, which is a colossal 174,000 in 4 years, even though some people on that benefit will pass away. But Scottish Enterprise pointed out that the people with this disability payment are already in employment, and they've suggested that enhanced support for employers who recruit disabled people might actually be better.
Well,
that would reduce the kind of impact of that, surely.
It is. So there's two aspects there. In essence, I would still reiterate the point that the way to change the trajectory is if you were to change the eligibility, and I think what is behind that question, if I'm understanding it correctly, Convener, is you could, for example, the case is made by others that you only pay disability payments for those that are out of work, or in some way means
No, but
tested.
people are working, they pay taxes, so that reduces the share of the Scottish budget that's actually going on welfare, even if the welfare budget doesn't decrease. You know, if you increase the Scottish budget by 10% because more, or 5% or whatever, because more people are working, you know, then you can afford these welfare payments. The issue is the economy is not growing, but the welfare budget share of it is, and it's squeezing every other aspect of the Scottish budget, causing real difficulties for universities, colleges, justice sector, local government, everywhere.
Yep.
That's the issue.
So on that point, Convener, that's why I was very pleased, I think it was last week or the week before, to actually attend the opening of a hub in Beath, which marked...
Well, the one I never get invited to or told about, even though it's my constituency.
Yeah, and you're going to a slightly sensitive area there, convener. But it was an important aspect of how we are ensuring that the type of employability support that is specifically for disabled people is now available in all 32 local authorities. So that takes the support that was available in some areas but not others to a national approach to be able to do exactly the type of thing that you mentioned around ensuring that those with a disability, if they are able to do so, can find employment and to find employment in a supported way. So the Government was very pleased to be able to announce that additional funding to ensure that that support is now available right across the country.
Okay, thanks very much. And I look forward to getting a reply to the letter I sent 2 weeks ago as to why I never got a notification of that meeting. So, Craig, before by Ross.
Good morning, Minister. In terms of your government's sort of philosophical position in relation to welfare spending, do you see it as a mark of success that the number of people in receipt of benefits goes up, or do you see it a mark of success that the number of people in Scotland in receipt of benefits goes down over the long term?
I think it's a mark of success if those that are eligible for a benefit are supported to get that benefit and no longer feel a stigma to get what they are entitled to. So one of the reasons why benefit expenditure, particularly on adult disability payment, is going up to a greater extent here than it is in the rest of the UK is because, as been pointed out by, I think, the Fiscal Commission and others, it's because people are supported through that process. It's then analysed to ensure that if they're eligible, they get it. If they're not eligible, they don't. But there's a supportive process, and that people are coming forward that did not come forward under the current system because of the stigma.
So would you say your government's better at getting people onto benefit than getting people off benefits?
I would say that all governments have a responsibility to ensure that if benefits are available, then there is a take-up strategy to allow those people to get those benefits that they are eligible for. And we have a benefit take-up strategy to ensure that those that are eligible are supported to get what they're entitled to. That's something which we have a cross-party understanding on, I think, when it comes to pension credit, a reserved benefit. Everyone seems to be in agreement that pensioners should have a benefit take-up strategy and should be encouraged. And I think that's the same type of strategy that we should also have for disabled people, carers and those on low incomes.
You've said that at the heart of the benefit system should be fairness and respect. What does it say to taxpayers in relation to your government's approach to showing them fairness and respect, that your government seems unwilling to pursue £36 million of welfare expenditure that was either mispaid or claimed through fraud?
So, as I said out at the start, and I'm very happy to go into a lot more detail, and I'm sure David Wallace will as well, is just factually incorrect to say that the Scottish Government is not going forward with any analysis and then action into the historic debt that's been built up with the benefits that were administered by the DWP that have now been administered. We can spend as much time as you like, Mr Hoy, going through this, because I'm very content that we have a very robust process in dealing with fraud, as David Wallace has laid out, and a robust process to ensure that what we do with overpayments is robust but fair.
So would you anticipate over time that that figure would fall proportionately as a percentage of the benefits bill?
Well, what I'm very, very assured by is the work that we have done and will continue to do within the agency to look at different types of overpayments and to ensure that we take that very seriously. Now, and it goes back to a point that we had in portfolio questions, where we have to be careful about if a number increases. Sometimes a number will increase because the number of benefits which the agency has is increasing. So, of course, as you massively increase the caseload, then the level of redeterminations, of appeals, of cases to do with overpayment will increase. But what we also, of course, then need to analyse to get the proper context is the proportion of the benefit entitlement that is an overpayment or is seen to be fraud. So I'd rather than talking about total numbers, as we continue to still increase the number of benefits that the agency has, talk about the proportions within the agency for different benefits. And again, if we wish, we can go into further detail on that if you wish us to do so.
I think perhaps colleagues may want to do so. Just to turn to the Scottish Child Payment, which in relation to the work that it's done to lift children out of poverty, I think has been welcomed by a number of third sector groups and independent analysts. But I want to talk about those who are above the poverty line who are in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment. You'll be aware that last July, Spice prepared a paper and it showed in a graph that more Scottish Child Payment recipients are above the poverty line than are below it. Do you not think that with the Scottish Child Payment, if it was better targeted, you could be more effective in lifting children above the poverty line rather than basically measuring it against average disposable income after housing costs?
So I don't have the Spice briefing to hand. You'll forgive me, Mr Hoy, but I'm happy I'll make sure my officials furnish me with that to see where that level of argument was going. What we need to bear in mind about the Scottish Child Payment is it is, in essence, a top-up benefit to current benefits. And the reason that legislative foundation was decided upon was it was the quickest way that we could get money into people's pockets at the time where there was a real concern, there still is, but a real concern around austerity and the need to respond to the calls that were being made on the Scottish Government to assist through a Scottish Child Payment. So it's attached to universal credit is the main benefit that it's a top-up to. There are a small number of other benefits, but because it's a top-up to that benefit, that's therefore the eligibility is based on that. Now, we have taken further powers within a more recent act to allow us to change the legislative basis for the Scottish Child Payment. So in the future it could be changed so that it isn't a top-up benefit to another reserved benefit, to a reserved benefit, but we could set our own eligibility. That would be a decision that we would have to look at the time to see whether those changes were worthwhile or not. But I would say that the Scottish Child Payment is targeted. The impact it makes on relative and absolute poverty has been set out by not just government but by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others. But I hope that gives you an explanation about why it has the legislative basis that it has and why it's targeted in the way that it has. And I would say that the delivery of the Scottish Child Payment was one of the successes of devolved social security, and that it was the quickest the benefit has ever been implemented by any part of the UK social security system.
Okay, but the First Minister has set as one of the central pillars of his government to eradicate child poverty, to lift people out of child poverty. And the Spice graph that I'm looking at from last July says that after the Scottish Child Payment is made, 25% of children are still below the poverty line and 75% are above the poverty line. But a very significant number of those were actually above the poverty line prior to receipt of the Scottish Child Payment. So if you were serious about eradicating child poverty, wouldn't you be bolder in addressing those who are effectively below the poverty line rather than those who are below UK median income?
Well, again, I go back to the point that the legislative basis for the Scottish Child Payment is being in receipt of universal credit. I have not seen evidence that would suggest to me that universal credit is given to people that are not in poverty and is somehow a profligate measure that allows people to live with great expanse. Indeed, all the work that's done by again, I go back to the work by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the IPPPR and others that suggest that those are on universal credit lack the ability to get the basic essentials in life, which is why we've called on the UK Government to deliver an essentials guarantee. So I think we have to just be very cautious about talking about people who are on universal credit as if they're living in this rather profligate and expansive financial context, because I think the evidence, not just from government but from others, is that they're not.
Okay, one element to universal credit is there is a taper within that basically leads to almost as a soft touchdown, so that people are incentivised to go into work and can keep more of their benefits for a period of their earnings. Your government, certainly talking to the Finance Secretary, she's always said to me she's very, very keen to make sure you don't embed cliff edges within any legislative or policy intervention. But it strikes me there is a cliff edge in relation to the Scottish Child Payment, which means that effectively, I've done a kind of back of the envelope calculation, but it seems to me that the taper gives you something like a 5 times greater incentive to take on extra hours and to work harder than you would with the Scottish Child Payment, because you lose it at a certain level. Have you looked at any form of taper for the Scottish Child Payment that would basically remove the cliff edge that your government says it's keen to not have as a central element of any public policy?
So again, it is very important, and there has been analysis done to look at the Scottish Child Payment to see whether it's a disincentive to work, and the evidence that it has been gathered that at its current level it is not a disincentive to people taking up employment. And I think that's a very important part of the work that we're doing. I also go back to the work that's been done out with government to be able to, I think, demonstrate very clearly the fact that universal credit does not cover the basic essentials in life. So what the Scottish Child Payment does is provide additional income to people to assist them with the essentials of life. It doesn't do everything by any manner means that those campaigners wish us to do, and there is indeed many calls for us to increase the level of the Scottish Child Payment to further deal with the inadequacy of universal credit. But it is important, again, I think, to have the context that those on UC and Scottish Child Payment are still very much in poverty or just on the cusp of poverty, and we are assisting with that. When it comes to tapers, clearly it is an option to look at tapers for the Scottish Child Payment, if that's what Mr Hoy is suggesting. It is possible for that to be built in. That does build in additional complexity to the system, and I go back to the point that I made earlier about why we brought in the Scottish Child Payment in the manner that we did, was to ensure its quick delivery. Any changes that anybody wished to see that would develop a taper would require changes to the programmes and changes to the processes and systems. So it's not something that could be done overnight, even if the government was persuaded that that was something that should be done. But I would stress it's not an aspect that we're looking at this time, because at this point we are still very much concerned about the inadequacy of UC and therefore the income that's coming into many people.
And just finally, in relation to adult disability payment, you'll be aware that the Scottish Fiscal Commission has pointed out to us that there's a significant gap between those coming off the benefit in Scotland versus the UK, 2% versus 16%. What is your government going to do to address that? Because surely that's one of these red flags in relation to sustainability of a benefit.
So then I think it's important that we go from that headline and then look at the reasons for that. So if I can break it down, convener, if I may. The analysis that is the 2% for the current social security reviews, a large proportion of that is case transfers that have came over from the DWP. So in essence, they aren't a typical review. It was something that was done for that case transfer to allow to happen. What we will see within future analysis of reviews from Social Security Scotland is what that looks like when a case is reviewed from Social Security Scotland decision. So that's different from the case transfer. So we'll see that number increasing from that 2% because the case transfers are now complete. If we can then take the 16% from the DWP, just under half of the, I think it's about 40%, I'll get the figures later, but just under half of the decisions that are made around reviews from the DWP are overturned at a later point in the process, either through their version of a redetermination or an appeal. So that then takes their 16% down quite markedly because they've made the wrong decision about that review. So it's not really 6% at the end of the process. What we're then left with is, yes, of course, we will wish to compare the Social Security number out with case transfers with the DWP number at the end of the process once appeals have been taken into account, which is the work that's currently ongoing both within the Directorate and the agency to look at the quality of the work and the decision-making that's going on. Now, I'm aware that answer's already taken quite a bit of time, Convener, but if there's more information that Mr Hoy wishes, David Wallace can go into what's happening, and Ian perhaps as well go into what we are actually doing to already look at that review to make sure that that review process is fit for purpose.
Okay, thank you very much. I would just say that I first raised the issue of tapering at SNP conference, what, 1986, I think it was. So it's a long-running saga. Ross to be followed by Liz.
Thanks, Convener. And I was just about to say good morning, but it is no longer the morning. Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. If I could just go back to the questions around recovery of incorrect payments. You and I have had discussions before in relation to the housing bill and council tax arrears, so a different area but similar kind of principles around the tipping point where it's not actually viable, it's not good value for money to try and recover money because there's the cost, the immediate cost of recovery, but also situations where potentially it's pushing an individual or a family further into crisis, which is morally wrong, but there's also then a further cost to the state from the consequences of that. I'd be interested just briefly if you'd be able to expand a little bit in relation to recovery of incorrect social security payments, how that's taken into consideration and what the tipping point is where it is no longer value for money to try and recover these incorrect payments.
If I can bring in David Wallace on this, and within that, obviously, the difference between what is an error and what is fraud, and the different ways we look at that. But David can perhaps furnish you with the details.
So what we don't have is a sort of a bar, as it were, that if income drops below, then this happens or that happens. What we would encourage through all of the process is to keep in touch with our recoveries teams. And as I mentioned earlier, they're particularly trained. They're trained around about trauma, they're trained with intelligence kindness, they're trained to stop safeguarding. So that has been quite deliberate, so that contact with the client is a really important thing that we do. So it should be a conversation and a discussion about their financial circumstances, what is affordable, what is not affordable. And we also have methods where we can refer clients on to financial support. The Money Advice Trust, for example, is a place that we would say if people are struggling to make payments. And at the moment, those are voluntary payments that we're taking off as well. So they're set at a level that clients should be able to articulate that they are affordable, and we are comfortable that they're affordable as well. We're also quite clear that it's a continual conversation, so it's not that people are setting up this is the payment and this will be the payment forever after. We encourage clients to keep in touch with us if their circumstances change, if their available funding changes, whatever might be the case. So we'd always emphasise that element around about keeping in touch, and we are really mindful of not pushing people into financial hardship for all the reasons that Cabinet Secretary and you're outlining. I think just the knock-on of the much wider system, that if we're just simply knocking people into debt or issues elsewhere, that's not a good result for the public.
Could I just check, are these payments covered by, forgive me, I can't remember the underpinning the legislation in this respect, are these payments covered by the debt write-off rules? So council tax debt in Scotland's at a 20-year limit. There's lots of other forms of debt and public sector repayments that are at a 5 or 6 year cut-off point. Are social security payments covered by any of that? Is there a point where they time out, regardless of the circumstances under which they've been accrued, even if it is fraud? Is there a point at which, after 5, 6 years, etc., they would time out? Because that principle operates on the basis that even in situations where, for example, it has been fraud, if it's not paid off within 6 years, it's very often because the individual is in circumstances where realistically it's never going to get paid off, and it's actually costing the state more to try and recover it than it would recover.
Yeah, I would need to check on that point, actually. We may not have reached that stage with some recoveries. Yeah. Again, as the Cabinet Secretary has pointed out, a lot of what we are doing is about a system that's still settling. You know, we still have an active programme of new benefits coming our way. That's a point I would need to check, I'm afraid. Come back to you.
Thanks very much. And if I could take a kind of wider view here, and I'm uncomfortable even using the language of value for money when we're talking about just giving people a bit of basic dignity in their lives, very often very, very vulnerable people who are really struggling. But I think we can all recognise that poverty costs a huge amount of money. It costs the individuals who are in poverty a huge amount of money. It costs the state, the wider economy, a huge amount of money. It has an impact on the health service, criminal justice, loss of productivity, etc. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned Professor Linda Bald's report, I think, in your opening remarks. I'd be interested in whether it's that report or what other sources are being used in relation to your part of the spending review, how you strike the balance here about what is an appropriate amount of money from a very limited public sector pot to invest in social security, and where, if that money was invested elsewhere, there might be an immediate saving. You take billions out of this and put it into colleges that we were discussing before, but where there could be long-term, more significant costs. How does that all factor into the exercise you're undertaking with the spending review at the moment? And is it Professor Bald's work that is the kind of North Star that's guiding you here, or are there other sources that you're using to make these value for money calculations?
So I think the work that's been done by Professor Bald is exceptionally important, because it's an area where we are continuing to build the work now that we've had still a relatively small number of years of devolved social security, but what is the impact of that devolved social security system on child poverty or on the support to disabled people and their carers? So those aspects are looked at. Clearly, one of the other areas where we're very keen to look at touches on the points that the convener made at the start about the impact on poverty levels, about policy A compared to policy B. Now, there's also then what gets children and their family out of poverty immediately compared to a policy which will then assist that family out of poverty in the longer term, 5, 10 years. So it's never black and white, and it's not an easy comparison to make. But those are the types of works that we're trying to look at in terms of how many children are lifted out of poverty by a policy. And that's not just for social security, that's for changes to childcare, changes to employability. And then the added layer of complexity about not working in silos, because a change to childcare may not necessarily make a difference unless you also ensure that there's supportive employability measures to go alongside that. So there is a kind of multi-layered approach to that type of work, but that's what we're undertaking as we develop the next delivery plan for tackling child poverty at the same time as we're going through our budget and spending review process. So those two processes, both the finance and the tackling child poverty, need to be interlinked, and interlinked right across government as we do that forecasting, which is difficult, particularly when we look at longer term impacts, but necessary when we're looking at those policy choices.
Thanks very much. You mentioned a moment ago the review work that found that the Scottish Child Payment is not acting as a disincentive for parents and carers to enter into employment. I'd be interested if there's any equivalent work that's been done, perhaps I'm just not aware of it, around the adult and child disability payments. Now, those are not connected to employment. There's a cost to being disabled, whether you are in work or not. I think that's a really important principle for those payments. But it would be interesting to know if there's any work that's taking place there, particularly given, from this committee's perspective, our interest in getting more economically inactive people who are able to work and who want to work into work. Has there been any analysis of the impact or not of those two payments on family employment prospects?
So I'm happy to provide further information if we can on that, and it may not just be from the Scottish Government. It goes back to why in Scotland CDP or ADP, or when we're looking down south, personal independence payment are in, and they are there to recognise the additional costs of being disabled, whether you're in employment or not. It was to recognise those additional costs. And that's an important principle of why those benefits are there. The changes that were proposed by the current UK Government to PIP rather turned that on its head, because it was taking away support from people. And what clearly became evident from the concerns from disabled people's organisations, for example, that was you were less likely to get into employment or to be able to stay in the employment that you were already in, because many people used their adult disability payment or PIP down south to be able to allow them to deal with some of the additional costs, and that supported them into employment. I think there is more work that needs to be done to take it from the work that DPOs have done with their own members, which I absolutely appreciate and think that their case is exceptionally credible, and I would support that. But there's clearly still discussions in the rest of the UK about those types of policy changes. And the reason why that's still important to me is the discussions we've had near the start of this session around the impact of a policy change there has massive impacts on our block grant for social security. So it's an area where I had a roundtable very recently with DPOs to discuss their continuing concerns around what was still happening under the welfare changes that are still in place around UC, but also their concerns about the fact that certainly at a UK government level there seems to have been a move away from this acceptance that CDP and ADP were there to support you with those additional costs of being disabled. And if that principle is in question, then I think there is a degree of work that we all have to do if we still agree on that premise to be able to show the importance of it. And part of that is about how those things support people into employment, or indeed support them so that they are not socially isolated, even if they are some of the people who will not be able to get into employment.
Thanks, George. I'm not one to suggest reviews for the sake of reviews, but given this is such a significant area of expenditure, the expected growth in it that the convener mentioned a minute ago, and the wider UK-wide political context you mentioned, having that really robust evidence base that demonstrates that it's not a disincentive to work and potentially is actually supporting economic activity, I think would be quite valuable to the discussions going forward. I expect that's probably not realistic in the time frame we're looking at for spending review decisions before the end of the year, but it's something in the not much longer term that I would encourage the government to look at. Thanks, convener.
Thank you very much. Liz to follow by John.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, you said in answer to the convener at the start that you were very disappointed about the report that had been in the Scotsman regarding the 36 million, and it wasn't accurate. Do you mean that the 36 million is not an accurate figure?
The figure is accurate. To describe it as a black hole and to describe it as something which then means that the Scottish Government is not looking to recover some of that is inaccurate. So I have no issue with the figure. I have issue with the interpretation that that somehow meant that the Scottish Government was just going to leave that to one side and not do anything about it.
So if the 36 million is accurate, what is your estimate of how much you will be able to recover?
So this is some of the work that we are still undertaking with the DWP to get an understanding of what sits behind that 36 million. So what benefits they are all, what proportion of that 36 million is for disability benefits, what's for carers, what's for industrial injuries, because they will have a different recovery proportion behind it, and that is a piece of work that we cannot do alone. We need to do with the DWP and get that information. But Ian can provide some, well, as much as we can, because clearly there's two governments working on this, so I don't want to
I understand that, Cabinet Secretary. It's just that it is a very important amount of money. And I think, given what the convener was rightly asking, we have a duty to scrutinise that. So I think if the convener agrees, it would be helpful if we could get an update on that fairly quickly, because it does matter for the budget, because it's a large sum. It would be very helpful if we could have an update just as soon as possible.
So if I can just come back on that, though, that requires us to get information from the DWP. So we will endeavour to do what we can to provide you with that information, but we need information from the DWP to assist us in what benefit that's from. And I would also caution against an assumption that this has an impact on next year's budget, because it doesn't have an impact on 1 year's budget. The work that we do to recover overpayments is obviously something that's done over time. So it's not just about that, but with those two caveats, very happy to provide the information if we can at all.
I understand that it has implications for budgets generally, which brings me nicely to the next point. The convener attempted twice to ask you about the opportunity costs of, and again it comes back to the scrutiny of this Parliament, on what modelling does the Scottish Government believe that the approaches it's taking to social security are providing better benefits and better outcomes to delivering the anti-poverty strategy than it would be against college funding or schools funding, early years funding, a whole lot of different things. What is the actual opportunity cost measurement that the Scottish Government is undertaking to provide the evidence for the policy decisions that the Scottish Government has made that allows financial scrutiny in this committee that these policies are the right ones?
So, my apologies if I wasn't clear enough to the convener earlier on. It ties into the work I think I've just also spoken to Ross Greer about the type of work that's going on as we draft up the next child poverty delivery plan, at the same time as we're going through our budget and spending review processes. So, as part of that, across government, we are looking at what policies can be taken right across government, social security being but quite a small part of that, to see the differences that policies could make. So that's the type of work that's been undertaken as we deliver the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan, which will be published next year. And of course, the decisions for that we need to take account of as we're moving forward for the budget. So that's the type of work that is undertaken on these measures about one policy compared to another policy.
Cabinet Secretary, the Social Security budget by the Fiscal Commission is predicting that between the coming budget and 29-30, it's going to go up by nearly 30%. That is a huge increase. And what this committee is interested to know in relation to that spend, as against what might be cut, and we've heard already this morning various other portfolios complaining bitterly about the lack of money that they have. In order to make the judgments, this committee has to see what the outcomes are. And that's the question that I think is a huge issue for the Scottish Government, given what the Scottish Fiscal Commission is saying is a completely unsustainable social security benefit system for the future.
I would again point to the fact that the increases in the level of social security expenditure, I think, need to be looked at for two aspects. One aspect that's down to changes that are happening right across the UK and therefore will be covered by BGA, and then the additional investment which we make. Now, I appreciate just because we get the money in from Social Security block grant adjustments, it doesn't necessarily have to be spent on Social Security. It is up to the Scottish Government to make entirely different aspects around that. The second point I would make is that the increase in expenditure is not due to any new changes to eligibility that the Scottish Government is bringing in. So this is about the eligibility which is currently within the system that has been passed by this Parliament, and those policy decisions following through to an increase in social security expenditure. So I think it is very important. I totally appreciate there is quite rightly, both within this committee and indeed in government, an analysis around the increasing levels of social security. But those are conscious decisions that's been taken by this government to protect disabled people, carers and those on low incomes. And the changes and the increase that's coming forward is not because we're due to make any further changes to eligibility that Parliament's not already voted on.
But your colleague Shona Robson, as Finance Secretary, said to this committee 2 weeks ago that there are certain decisions that the Scottish Government is not going to be able to pursue in a way that they would like to have been able to do. And she referenced free school meals, and she said that rollout wasn't going to be as extensive as the Scottish Government would have liked. Now, that means, I would hope, that there is a conscious decision within government to decide how the money would be better spent on other things. But there are others who will argue that free school meals is a very important part of the strategy to attack poverty. So, can I ask again, Cabinet Secretary, where is the decision-making criteria that is being undertaken by the government to decide on which areas have the best outcomes in tackling poverty?
So if we look at the aspects around free school meals, clearly the Scottish Government remains committed to universal free school meals within primary schools. And we are obviously working on the pilots on S1 to S3 for those in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment. We are not moving forward with the universality for P6 and 7s at this moment in time, and are targeting that to those within receipt of the Scottish Child Payment, because we have taken the decision, given the financial context, to not have universal free school meals, but to target it to those that are in poverty and are in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment. So actually, I would suggest that this is a demonstration of the fact that the Scottish Government's taken a very difficult decision about not moving as fast as it would like on universalism for free school meals, because it has targeted the level of expenditure within P6 and 7 and indeed the pilots to those that are in poverty.
So is it also a recognition from the Scottish Government that various universal policies are not going to be able to continue in the future because we simply can't afford them?
No, and many of the universal policies, again, sit out with my portfolio, but there is, Liz Smith and I have had these conversations both in the Chamber and Social Security Committee. There are reasons for universalism to be in place, quite rightly, and there are other policies that should be targeted. But the government has no plans to take away benefits or entitlements from people. And I think that's a very important reassurance we can give, because although we are talking about those that are in poverty, the cost of living crisis impacts on many people that aren't caught by poverty measures. And it's important that they know, as they look to the years ahead, that the government's not going to take anything away from them, because that, I think, would cause great concern for people that are still struggling.
Your colleague is arguing strongly that you cannot roll out universalism to a greater extent because you simply can't afford it. And to come back on the point that you raised earlier in your comments, what the government is wanting to do is to target those most in need. That's what we signed up to in 2018. And I'm suggesting to you that the policy of universalism across the board is simply not sustainable for the Scottish budget.
So we are still committed to universal free school meals for primary age. What has changed is the timescales for that delivery. I would say that the levels that we have within social security are targeted. So in essence, you point to that 2018 Act. It is targeted at those on low incomes, those that are disabled, and those that are carers. There are other parts of government policy and other portfolios which are universal, which have been, again, decisions that the government has taken, and there, I'm sure, is a debate to be had amongst our stakeholders and others about universalism. But I think it's an important reassurance that the government has tried to give to people, that we would not take entitlement away from people.
I'll leave it there. I'm sure the debate will continue.
Indeed. Thank you. John, to follow by Michael.
Thanks very much, Convener. I mean, there was mention made before of some issues are UK-wide and some issues are specific to Scotland. And in the Scottish Fiscal Commission's one somewhere that they wrote, they talk about, we think the UK-wide higher demand for disability benefits especially is because of a deterioration in health, meaning more people are eligible, plus the cost of living pressures are encouraging more people to actually apply. Is that something you think is a UK-wide issue? You recognise that? Is health getting worse?
So I think there's also another important aspect of this, and it came through very clearly at that round table that I mentioned I had with DPOs and other stakeholders, and that was the number of people that are coming forward for disability benefits because of mental health or because of other conditions which they previously had not been supported to apply for, or because there was stigma within society that's prevented them from coming forward. So I heard very compelling evidence from contributors at that round table that there are a number of people who are now coming forward for reasons to do with mental health that would not have come forward in the past. They were still eligible for it in the past, but they didn't come forward. Now, there's then a question of whether that's a good or a bad thing. I think it's a good thing if stigma in mental health has reduced, and therefore people can have open discussions and get a benefit to which they've always been entitled but never felt they were able to achieve. So that's the one other aspect I would perhaps add on to that, is the changes in our societal discussions around some disabilities and conditions that have seen a particular increase in certain aspects of caseload.
Okay. I mean, personally, I certainly agree with what you're saying, and I agree with what the government is trying to do. I think the question for this committee is, can we afford what we want to do? And I mean, the SFC goes on and talks about how people in Scotland, are supported more. You used the word support yourself just now. We've promoted some of these payments more. And I suppose I'm left just wondering, are we being too... I want us to be kind, I want us to be gentle, I want us to be nice, but, are we going too far down that road because we can't afford it?
There's also aspects, again, which I alluded to earlier, about how the work on particularly adult disability payment, but child disability payment as well, as a preventative spend. So if we were to reduce the amount of support that were given to people, would we then see that in an increase in demand on our health services or on our social care services, for example? So I think there is a need for us to look at the implications of reducing a benefit on the health service, for example. So that's one area. The other area which is attached to that is, if you reduce the eligibility for disabled people, you're also by default reducing the eligibility for carers benefits, and then we would see many unpaid carers in our constituencies not receiving financial support that they currently do. And I don't have the figures to hand, but we can again provide to a committee again the discussion which committee will be well aware of about the actual contribution that unpaid carers make and if unpaid carers weren't doing what they were doing, the impact that it would have on our health and social care. So it's also the important aspects around if you reduce expenditure on social security, what would happen within health, and what would happen to those unpaid carers as well. And we can provide further information on that, convener, after this session.
I mean, I agree with all your arguments. They're all well put, and clearly if we can help people, then their health improves and there's not the same pressure elsewhere. I still wonder, as I think the committee does, as to whether we're getting the balance right in all of this, because we do call it capping, call it rationing, whatever you want, but if people need hip replacements, they have to wait for quite a long time. If people want to get into a care home, they also have to wait quite a long time, because there is a limit to these budgets, and we can only spend so much on operations or care homes or nursing staff or all of these things because there's a cap. But there seems to be no cap on your budget, this budget. And I understand it's demand-led, but for example, does it have to increase by inflation every year? And I realise if it doesn't, then people are less well off. But is that not one way of controlling the expense?
It does increase by inflation every year. We voted on that as a parliament within the last Act that just went through.
Yes.
Initially from a Jeremy Balfour amendment, but then it was a Scottish Government amendment, which we'll have to check the record to see just how that vote went. But Parliament voted to increase the remainder, many of which we were already required by statute to increase from the 2018 Act. But Parliament agreed, I think, universally to extend
I supported that as well, yes.
The other aspects is, yes, it's demand-led, which is an important aspect of that. And then, in essence, the other cap, if you like, is around eligibility. I go back to the point I made to the convener. The way that you change the trajectory in spending is change the eligibility and take people out of being eligible for a payment. That in essence, is how to tackle it. The other area where the government could then look to spend monies in different ways is if we didn't have to mitigate against UK government policies, which I again alluded on earlier. So demand-led, based on eligibility, yes, it goes up by inflation, and the aspect which would, I think is a separate discussion, is what could be done with the money if we weren't mitigating.
Okay, thanks, convener.
Okay, and Michael to follow by Michelle.
Thank you, convener. Thanks, Cabinet Secretary, for the evidence so far. Can I start with the £36 million, please? We go back to that. So, if somebody were to be fined in court for fraudulently claiming benefits, would that fine be added to their debt?
Again, just to... Sorry, do you want to come in, Cabinet? Yeah. So I would separate the 36 again. That has been accrued under DWP
sorry,
rules.
I'm speaking about specific circumstances. Were somebody to be fined for not claiming that, would it add to their debt as an individual? So it's not specific to the 36 million, it's about individuals and where this to happen.
So, in a Scottish case, then, if they went through courts and a fine was imposed, we would always seek recovery if we were going to court of it. I suspect that would be separate from a fine, as I would understand it. I'd need to double check, but a fine would be a penalty for having committed the offence. But we would always seek recovery in a fraud case.
So they would be handled separately. So the fine element would be dealt with separately. Then it wouldn't be added to the recovery process that you're describing.
Again, I can only talk from what I think would happen in a Scottish case at the moment, and I'm not actually sure we've had that situation. So again,
it would be interesting, because I think part of the issue that I suppose I want to explore in that is an issue of deterrence and what happens, particularly if a court is making a decision about a fraudulent issue where somebody is stealing money from their fellow taxpayers and their fellow citizens. question as to whether if that were to accrue, whether there's any means by which that you're talking about it recovering. But perhaps you can come back with detail on that in writing. That would be appreciated. But I've also not picked up in your evidence so far, Cabinet Secretary, what you're actually going to do to get the money back. What actions? So you've rejected the Westminster approach, and you've given some grounds for that. What are you going to do?
So again, if we separate what currently happens with the benefits to what the 36 million is in relation to the aspects which, again, Ian can come into furnish you with further details about discussions that are currently happening with the DWP about the types of information we need. For example, for which benefit is that has that overpayment been made? That will then assist us in being able to move forward with having approaches to be able to tackle that. Until we get that information, then it's quite challenging then to hypothecate where that goes. But what I think is, I hope, useful to committee is to point to the work that we currently do, because those are the types, that's the type of work that the agency already undertakes to be able to deal with overpayments, both error and fraud, and they are treated differently, which I hope committee agrees they should be. So that's the type of work that we do and that we'll continue to do, and in essence can give a guide to the types of work that could be done to undertake the recovery of some of that 36 million. Again, to be clear around the 36 million, there is no scenario where that whole 36 million was going to get recovered by the DWP, because there are obviously different success rates for the rate of recovery that's happened. So we need the information about the 36 million, and that what we do in terms of recovery is based on the agency work, which David can go into further detail about how we do that with different benefits, if that would help give examples of how we take it very seriously, but it's dealt with in a different way depending on the individual context.
So this is the thing I'm interested in. You've rejected the approach to try and drive up the amount that can be reclaimed by the government, the UK government. So what are you doing to try and drive up that number? You're saying that you have to look at the numbers and you have to get more detail, I understand. But, I mean, how long have you known about this?
Not very long, because unfortunately the usual circumstances allows the Scottish Government to have knowledge about what will be in a bill before it's introduced. That unfortunately didn't happen in this context, which does make the cooperation between the two governments difficult, particularly on area around fraud. We've then been working about how that bill could be changed. We've now reached that end of the process, and the work is ongoing now about getting the information that lies behind. So there's been a series of steps that we're undertaking. But again, I point to the fact that David can go into as much detail as the committee would like about how we do deal with fraud and error, and that's exactly the type of work that we would undertake around this 36 million as well. So we can...
So again, just to reiterate that point, again, I talk about the generality. I personally don't know what constitutes in there, what efforts have been made to recover it. So that I think is part of what Cabinet Secretary is outlining. We simply don't know at the moment what that looks like. So
what do you do? What do you do to try and recover issues that are arising in Social Security Scotland right now?
Well, as I'd outlined earlier on, if we have an overpayment that arises, our first effort is to try and speak to the clients involved. If it's a recoverable overpayment, and try to get a voluntary arrangement. So try to understand their circumstances, try to understand what's preventing payment, what may be a barrier to that. And within sort of the principles of fairness, dignity and respect, we would seek to recover that. We then have other layers that we can go to. So we're about to pilot civil recovery, for example. So we've recently appointed a legal partner to pursue civil recoveries, and that again will be piloted for cases where clients haven't been willing to engage with us, and we still believe that there's recovery available around about that as well. And then obviously we're looking at the potential, if somebody is in a recurring payment, for enforced deductions of an overpayment from a recurring payment. But what we are really clear is that that has to have a challenge process somewhere built into that system, and we're just working through what that challenge is.
So do you think those mechanisms are sufficient then to deal with this issue?
They are robust. I mean, it's. I think I don't want to compare it with DWP processes. We haven't looked at it from a, comparing one system with another.
So what's your own success rate?
So again, numbers will be as we explained, the caseload's going up. So, for example, in 2023-24, we recovered 300,000.
What is that as a percentage of the amount of money?
So, as a percentage, at the moment in time, our balance is around about 10 million.
300,000 of 10 million pounds.
And just to kind of finish that off, so for example, in 24-25, that number went up to 1 million. So we recovered 1 million from our current balance.
Got
of
it
10.
up to 10% of the figure. Okay.
Yeah.
And you don't know what. So would you think that that's a successful record, Cabinet Secretary? The 10% recovery?
Well, I think one of the aspects that we are also need to take in, and I'm genuinely not trying to be obtuse, convener, is that there's some areas where some of the cases that David is referring to are still in a process because the agency is still very young. So, for example, if the agency is working through a voluntary recovery of some of the overpayments, but that doesn't prove successful, it can move to a next step in a process and a next step in the process. So in essence, we'll continue to see that number change. We are always very open, both within the government, to look at different approaches if there's something more that can be done.
But you've rejected the UK government's approach.
Yes.
And you've got a success rate at the moment of being generous, 10% in terms of recovery. Are you happy with that figure?
Well, I think it's, as I say, part of the challenge around that figure which David's given is the fact that many of these cases will still be in train. So you start off with the initial approaches about how to recover that, and if it's not possible, it can move through. But if David wants to provide some further information on that as well.
I'm asking you whether you, as the policy, it was your decision to not take on board the UK government position. That was up to you, and you set that out, and the reasoning for it. Are you happy, and you think that 10% is a reasonable position? Do you think that that's a reasonable outcome for the taxpayer?
So I think I will always challenge the agency, as indeed the agency challenges itself, to improve those numbers. I would.
So what tools are you going to give them to do something about it?
Well, they have been given extra tools within, for example, the Social Security Amendment Bill that just went through that will provide additional information on audit that will help them. And that's the type of work that will assist the agency and which the Parliament recently debated and passed. So that's an example of an additional tool that is within the agency's armoury once we go through the secondary legislation process within the Parliament. But I would again to deliver some context on the timing of this. The UK bill that we're talking about here still hasn't actually passed through the UK Parliament. It's not yet finalised. So I go back to the point.
Fair, I'm sorry. To be fair, that's not the part I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is your record of recovery and whether you're satisfied with 10%. Mr Wallace, you're keen to get in.
No, I'm just going to reiterate that point as well. And again, just some of those processes I've outlined that we will have available to us are not yet available. So again, we will always want to improve on that. But civil recovery, for example, is not yet a process that we're using. We have only recently appointed a legal partner for that. So again, I think that's quite a powerful collection methodology there.
Okay. Well, let's hope it does improve. Can I move on to the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan? I'll give you from that, Social Security statistics show a lower rate of adult disability benefit awards being ended or decreased at review. We will assess whether the current award review process is working as intended and if any changes may be required. Could you maybe update us on that, Cabinet Secretary, in terms of that piece of work?
So this is some of the work that I was alluding to with Craig Hoy earlier, and I think I went through in some detail the areas that's being done. The part we didn't perhaps get onto is the work that's already going on within agency to look at the the quality of decision making. So if I can perhaps bring in that, rather than repeat what I've already said, bring in the next aspect to that, which is...
I'll come back on some detail. Please, Mr Wallace.
So what we've been doing is a sort of joint bit of work with our policy colleagues around about looking quite carefully at our reviews, a kind of review of reviews. There is nothing that we are currently seeing that would cause us concern around about the quality of those reviews. So again, I think you're back to that wider system, but we do not believe that we're just making the wrong decision in reviews, if that's where you're coming from. So that percentage isn't reflected from there is something that fundamentally we've looked at somebody's eligibility, we've looked at it again, and we believe that review process is robust.
Okay. It's not where I'm coming from, I'm afraid. That's a quote from the government. So this is from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance in their name, so they want to see this done. Has a target figure been set for the amount of money that's to be saved in this area, Cabinet Secretary?
In social security in general?
Just
or?
no, on this area. So this was presented, and so the Fraser of Allender, for instance, have expressed concerns that it was a very woolly part of the document in particular. So there was a series of different policy measures that were set out, and there was no number set against this. So do you have a target saving that you have to make in this area in terms of the gateway re-reviews? The review of reviews, as Mr Wallace put it.
So the target is to ensure that the policy is working effectively. So rather than having an arbitrary target to say we'll bring down social security, or we expect that this will deliver a particular level of saving, what this work is about is ensuring that the policies are fit for purpose and as working as the policy intent as the Parliament passed. So I think the danger of the important part of this type of work is to take it back to first principles. What is a review supposed to do? And is it fulfilling the purpose of a review, which is to ensure that if you are eligible for the benefit, you keep the benefit. If you're not eligible for the benefit, you don't get the benefit.
But this was in a financial document.
Yes.
Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan, and it was about savings. It was under a headline that we're going to save £1 billion.
So yes, it's a financial document, but the important aspect of this is to take it back to first principles. We have a policy on reviews. We've clearly and rightly been challenged on the review percentage from Scottish Government is different to the review percentage from the DWP, which I went through with Mr Hoy earlier. So we've taken it back to the first principles about what is a review supposed to do. A review is supposed to ensure that you get the benefit you're entitled to, and you don't if you don't have that eligibility. And we're taking it back to that. And I think that's more robust way of trying to reassure ourselves that the system is working correctly, is take it back to that first principle about whether it's delivering as intended.
Thank you. So that piece of work has been completed then? Mr Wallace says the review of reviews has been undertaken. You're confident that you're making the right decisions. So that's done, and you reported back to Cabinet Secretary that no savings will be made in this area?
No, that's not what I said. With respect, Mr Manor, what we've talked about is the steps that have been taken within Social Security Scotland to have that, in essence, the review of reviews. Clearly then what will be undertaken with David, Ian, myself, CabSec, Finance and others is then an overall analysis about where we are in terms of review, looking at the type of work I talked about Mr Hoy, about where comparisons can rightly be made. So those initial steps of that work have been concluded. But we are still very keen to ensure that we're looking at the wider aspects of the review process to again make sure that the policy intent which Parliament passed is actually what's been delivered by the agency.
So can you tell us when that will be finished? Because one of our concerns, I think, as a committee is that there's £1 billion of savings. We don't know whether that's going to be represented in the Scottish Government's budget when it is presented at the start of next year, or if it's not. What you're saying at the moment is that there are no targets been set within this section that I've outlined for you to save money in this area. So you don't have a target, whether that be blunt or otherwise, but we're trying to understand the shape of the budget. So we're not expecting at the moment a contribution from you and a saving to that £1 billion on the basis of what you've just told us.
Well, what we always have to do is again, I go back to the first principles about if people are entitled to a benefit, they get it. If they're not entitled to a benefit, they don't get it. The other way you make savings is by changing eligibility. Those are the types of decisions that we'll make. And when it comes to targets, again, I go back to the point, if you want to see a reduction in welfare, this is about targeting people and changes to eligibility. Now, the other aspect is to make sure the system is as robust as it possibly can be. And that's one pillar that you've talked about was around the review process. And rather than it being a process where we're waiting to the end to see whether changes can be made, if there was aspects which came through the initial steps when that, we would be taking those steps immediately to deal with that. So it's an iterative process of learning and continuous improvement which the agency goes through. There's other aspects out with the review section where again we're continuously ensuring through the Directorate and agency that the system's as robust and as efficient as it could be in the changes that we can make.
It's very useful detail, Cabinet Secretary, but I don't think it's an answer to my question, which is about whether you're going to contribute a saving to that £1 billion of money that has been identified by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance.
So the aspects around whether there will be a saving or not will be dealt with by whether the learning that comes out of the work within agency and the wider government demonstrates that changes need to be made to policies, practices and procedures. And of course, as we go through the budget process and the spending review process, that's exactly where those types of learnings will then materialise in changes within budget. So those will be demonstrated within the publications that will come forward in due course.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, can I?
Kleiner.
Okay, I'll have to take a pick then. On the effective operation of appointeeships, if I can, I think it's probably, and this is, I think, about the general operation of Social Security Scotland. I'm concerned that there's a report of 33,000 appointeeships that are meant to be being reviewed by Social Security Scotland. I believe that since that was identified, only 8,600 has been reviewed, and there's been a very drastic reduction in the number of staff that have been applied to this task. Is that fair, Mr Wallace?
I think that's fair. I don't have those exact updated numbers in front of me. What I would say is that where we have focused our attention is people who are not yet in payment. So a number of those will have occurred as a result of case transfer. So there will have been already an appointee through the DWP system who have been part of a previous assessment, a part of a previous element of having gone through a check. So our focus, our resource at the moment is on those where there is any payment awaiting, so our newer ones under the Scottish system. But it's a fair reflection. We are consistently and constantly moving our resource to across all the benefits where we feel that we need them most. At this point in time as well, we're also having to move, probably where you're referring to there, some of that resource onto our benefits that are still to come our way, making sure that people are trained for the benefits over the winter period as well. So
I suppose my point with this is that it's about the sensible application of resources within the organisation. We've talked about operating costs, and we recognise that that is a challenge for you, given the scale of things you have to do. But the promise with this would be individual interviews with each of these 33,000 people. And there's a question I wonder whether Social Security Scotland are over-promising and under-delivering in terms of these are some of the most vulnerable people in Scotland, many of whom, identified by the work you've done so far, are being abused as a result of the abuse of their appointeeships. And the pace, the lack of pace that's been provided, you've said you're going to do this work, time is running on, and actually you're decreasing the resource against it. Given the time constraints, Convener, I appreciate it, could we have a written update in terms of what has been done, the promise that you made, and when you anticipate that that work is going to be concluded, and the number of staff who are being applied to the task, given that you've just acknowledged, Mr Wallace, that you've moved people off of that and into other areas already. As I say, these are some incredibly vulnerable people, some of the most disabled people in society, and I think that they deserve this. It's the promise that's been made. Thank you, Kabir.
Can I just come back on one point, which I think we'll be happy to provide further details on. And that's actually the operating costs of the agency compared to, for example, the DWP. The operating costs of the agency, which we continually challenge to ensure it's as effective as possible, is very good in comparison to DWP. So I think there is not an issue around operating costs of the agency.
Yes, I mean the FSDP says that operational delivery improvements will focus on improving performance and productivity alongside the delivery of internal savings and efficiencies, such as the continued automation of some payments. I think the issue is there's no numbers against that, and I think that's one of the issues that obviously always concerns committee, because if we are talking about a gap of 1,070 million going into next financial year for the Scottish Government budget, then we need numbers on things like that. Michelle.
Thank you for bearing with us. Just to finish on one tiny point on the 36 million, I just wanted to get a sense from you. I mean, you've laboured quite extensively the differential approach in terms of how you deal with this with Social Security Scotland, but I didn't get a strong sense of how your approach will differ where there's been an overpayment through error and not somebody's fault, and where it has been fraud as an intentional act of obtaining money by deception. OK, you're going to be fair, you're going to be nice, you're going to treat them with dignity, but clearly in that instance where it's fraud, it's an entirely different matter. So can you just give me a sense of how your processes will differ in that circumstance?
Do you want to comment on that?
Absolutely. So if I've not landed that, my apologies. The point I was making at the start is we do absolutely have that differential between how we're recovering overpayments versus fraud. We have an extensive capability in terms of counter fraud. We've brought resource and capability from across wide parts of the public sector who've very experienced with investigation of fraud. We have surveillance powers, which again we've got safeguards as to how we use them, but we have and we do use them. So we have a very sort of zero tolerance approach to it, and we have a team that will investigate all frauds. I think possibly it's already in the public domain around about reporting. So we have intelligence that comes into this organisation. All of those intelligent reports will be considered and we will investigate every single one of those as well. So we have absolute zero tolerance to it. All of our staff, as well as being trained in kindness, also trained in counter fraud. So our frontline staff are absolutely encouraged and understood as to what signs to spot and detect as well. So there is an absolute zero tolerance to fraud, and I believe that we are building robust capabilities and expertise within the organisation. So apologies if I didn't make that clear.
Yeah, and that is very helpful to put on the record, which didn't come out, accepting what you said about that article in the Scotsman, but being very firm about where it is the case of obtaining money fraudulently. That firmness of approach is quite heartening to hear, because it's entirely different to where an error occurs.
Sorry, am I allowed one? Just to probably add to that as well, we have a high bar in terms of fraud. This organisation does not determine if somebody has committed fraud. We report that to the Procurator Fiscal, and the court will determine if a fraud isn't in there. So I think sometimes when we talk about figures of fraud and suspected fraud, our figures can appear low because we are looking at those who have been through a journey towards a verdict from a court, which is obviously at the moment a very small number that have gone through that process. Yeah,
and that's also an extremely important clarification, because that's a differential approach from what's happening in the rest of the UK, and that will skew your figures without that clarification that it's going through, court processes where there will be a finding of fraud rather than a suspicion of fraud. OK, that's very helpful. I just wanted to pick up something right at the start of the conversation at Cabinet Secretary, just to understand by what you mean, because there's different meanings, and we may go on to that, by there is no black hole. What is your understanding? When you're saying that, what is it that you are saying, and what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think what could be inferred by the material in the press was that there was £36 million which the government expected to get that it's no longer getting, and I think that to me is what was inferred by this black hole approach, that somehow because the Scottish Government was not taking part in this one part of the bill. We are taking parts in other parts of the UK Government bill, that somehow we were setting aside £36 million. And I hope we have been able to demonstrate to the committee today that is far from the case. What we've disagreed about with the UK Government is the approach to recovering that money, but that what we'll do is we'll recover that money through the types of work that is already undertaken by David's agency, and that can be extrapolated to the work that will go on with the additional historic debt that will now be transferred.
And I mean, we've kind of laboured this point, and whatever percentage, whether it's 10% or more, but in terms of, I mean, my simple understanding of the terminology of black hole, of which people will say, oh, the Scottish Government's got a black hole equally well. You can say the UK Government's got a massive black hole. It's simply a term to express projected overspend against projected income. But the important differential with the UK Government, which I just wanted to briefly explore to you, is that other economists will argue, well, of course it's not a black hole because you can squeeze people till the pips squeak. In other words, you can raise tax, you can increase your borrowing, you can create money out of thin air vis-à-vis quantitative easing. This is different for the Scottish Government because the only fiscal lever available is to tax. So therefore, when you say there is no black hole, do you mean we don't need to worry about this difference between projected income and projected expenditure because we can just increase tax?
What we'll always do as part of every budget is have that budget laid out both in terms of our expenditure as a Scottish Government, one part of that being social security and the income we'll receive. Now, clearly decisions around tax are taken at every budget, although the First Minister has made clear there are certain changes that won't be made in the coming financial year to try and give some certainty to people. And it does then, yes, come back to the choices that are made by the government in terms of if there is not an increase in tax, then the government needs to take a decision about how to fund all of its planned expenditure, of which social security is a part of that. And again, we're at the foothills of the budgetary discussions, but if there are points which other parties wish to come forward from about how to change the level of expenditure on social security, or indeed change the tax proposals, then I'm sure they will come forward in due course.
And you've made exactly my point for you. We've got near-side considerations about the forthcoming budget, and we've got longer-term projections that, you know, a number of members have clearly, well, the Fiscal Commission has made it really clear, the challenges of the fiscal sustainability of social security payments being made at the rate they are. What I wonder is, when you're in discussions with senior colleagues, what's the kind of the discussions you're having where you're saying, oh, this looks like it's utterly unsustainable. How are we, on earth are we going to manage it? What's the tipping point? How are we modelling it? Goes back to some of the questions about opportunity costs. And it'd be useful to get your personal reflections of at what point you start to worry, rather than necessarily thinking, well, how do we get through the near-side budget that's coming up thick and fast? Because I've never really been able to detect any sense of longer-term strategic thinking where clearly the social security payments as they stand are going to be unsustainable.
Well, I don't think they are unsustainable. What we do have to do as part of this is work out as a government, and these decisions will come to Parliament for discussion and decision, is the choices that the government will set forward in its budget and within spending review about the decisions we've made to invest in social security. Now, others may wish to come forward and suggest that we should disinvest from social security and that we should take money away from people. And that is a very fair and right discussion to get into. But what will come from the government is the discussions that we've taken internally and the importance that we do place on social security as one way of alleviating poverty and supporting disabled people and carers.
Yeah.
And then those choices will be laid bare. I fully recognise that there is an increase in the level of social security expenditure. One of the ways to tackle that is to look to reduce that through changes to eligibility. And we've seen that attempt by the UK government. They've looked at the changes. They've looked at the increases that are coming forward, and they attempted to make changes to reduce eligibility, some of which they've now backtracked on. So that's a very right and proper discussion to be had. Is what people who should be eligible for benefits, and do we think the benefits are going to people who we as a parliament would be comfortable taking them away from people?
One minor point before I just come back to this. I don't think we can use the term invest in social security without having clarity over the return on that investment in the term of changed outcomes. And it goes back to the earlier discussion. So I personally would be quite wary about using the term investment, because it would immediately make someone like me say, well, show me the return on that investment. But that's not actually my question. I'm simply making an observation that it's helpful for this Finance Committee to hear you reflecting on areas where there will need to be further consideration, because in the hurly-burly of politics, we have got a lot of stuff about, the Scottish Government, there's this terrible black hole and all the rest of it. And the press are focusing on what's happening in the Scottish Government. And without clear wording, it impinges upon the trust and faith that people have on the ability of the Scottish Government to manage their financial affairs. So therefore, it might seem counterintuitive to you for this committee. It's very helpful to hear cautious, temperate language recognising the challenges coming ahead and owning those challenges. And if you don't mind me saying, I don't quite hear that enough from my point of view on the Finance Committee, because there clearly have to be decisions made, and clearly every political party needs to be party to them going forward, because they are the demand-led nature of our benefits is unsustainable.
Well, I would disagree with the last part about whether they're unsustainable, but I do go back to the point where the eligibility for our benefits has been proposed by government and then supported by Parliament. With very, very few exceptions has there been any votes against or even abstentions to the eligibility that we currently have. So then it does get into a very important discussion, which, to get away from the headline, which I often hear in Chamber about you need to decrease the amount spent on social security, and then the government's position is we do not intend to take benefits away from people and reduce eligibility, and those are wishing to see the spend on social security come down need to tell me where those changes to eligibility will be, because those in essence are the biggest, most substantive changes that you can make that will change the trajectory to that. Aside that, of course, is making sure that the system itself is efficient and effective as possible through some of the work that's been mentioned in the mid-term reviews, because we do need to look at the continuous improvement. And Mr Mara may be frustrated with me about whether I'll say that a certain aspect is a success or not. This goes back to the approach we continuously have about I'll never sit with my officials in their internal meetings and defend that what we have at the moment is all that it should be. What we then go into discussion is how do we improve and how does it get better and how do we interpret that going forward.
And that efficiency in system terms, of course, is important, but the other point that you haven't made is that given in the light of these statistics, our projections, I should say, really the other important thing is what policy levers, and it's more a decision for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, can you make so that the differential between projected spend and projected income isn't so stark. And I recall when I first got elected, I used to talk frequently about the creation of a sovereign wealth fund, for example. It's certainly at no point, and it's on the record, my antithesis of using any ScotWinds money for plugging a hole in revenue expenditure, but doing things like a sovereign wealth fund, because this is not going to be compute. And again, I won't ask you what the latest thinking is that. I don't think anything is happening in that respect, and it probably should, because the measures that you're trying to set out in terms of treating people fairly aren't going to be able to remain in place without doing something ambitious around creating wealth for the long term. So that's my tuppence worth. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to Michelle. I've got loads of questions to ask, but I'm not going to ask them all. I have to say the committee would lynch me if I did, but I do have a couple. I mean, I do think it's a bit two-dimensional to say it's about expenditure or it's about eligibility. If we have a growing, thriving, inclusive economy, then people will come out of poverty. It's not just about treating the symptoms of the disease, it's about the disease of poverty itself. And I've always believed in independence, not just for Scotland, but for individuals. Now, I have to say, I think one of the issues that we haven't really touched on is how you look at expenditure on one benefit against another. So, for example, how does the government decide that to continue to pay the bedroom tax, which, frankly, most people who receive it think was abolished years ago, as against, free school meals? How do they think? How do you decide which one you should go for? I think in terms of the two-child cap, how much is the two-child cap going to be per child per week?
So the final figure I do not, I'm sure it's in my pack somewhere, convener, but we will provide that to you. But it is, in essence, it's to take away the money that you see as reduced by. But I will get the exact figure to you. I take your point. It's not just about eligibility, but that is the important aspect that makes the biggest difference when it comes to whether the benefit bill increases or not. And I absolutely take your point about there are other ways to lift people out of poverty and more systemic natures to that. So I absolutely take that on board. For the bedroom tax versus the free school meals, I don't look at bedroom tax versus free school meals, but what we've done with the bedroom tax is have again, sense checking about what difference that makes. So one of the key reasons why we continue to mitigate against the bedroom tax, which, yes, I think people just assume it is abolished and it's not, it's mitigated against, is because it's one of the ways where we attempt to prevent homelessness and we assist people. So in essence, the mitigation of the bedroom tax is an important aspect around our housing policy to ensure that we are actually helping people to stay in. So it's an aspect around benefit which is not just about social security, but actually that is in essence a part of housing policy that we deliver through social security.
Well, one could argue that it disincentivises, continue to pay it someone moving from a 3 or 4 bedroom house to a 1 or 2 bedroom when families actually need that bigger house. But I don't want to go into that specifically.
Happy to provide information on that about how that's
I mean, I do think that there's plenty of other things you could spend that money on. I mean, for example, the FAI, Fraser Valdin Institute, said, that £1 in colleges would get £6 for the economy, and you're right. And I'm saying, when I said absolutely earlier on, I meant yes. If you're looking at things from a 12-month perspective, and that seems to be what the Scottish Government does. I mean, Michelle's right, there's no long-term strategic vision. If you're actually investing for the future, you will be investing more in universities and R&D and in colleges, etc., rather than just, trying to, put sticky tape over the budget every year. And that's a big frustration, I think, for this committee. But the last thing I want to ask is about when we, in response to Ross Gray, talked about research going into the Scottish Child payment and whether it disincentivises people to work. And I have to say that the Scottish Government pledged £20 by 2026 and it's £27.15, so they've gone above and beyond manifesto commitment. But if you think about someone who is on housing benefit and who's getting the bedroom tax and the Scottish Child payment and the and will benefit from this 2-child cap and free childcare and free school meals, that together is a pretty big disincentive to return to employment. And and potentially their children grow up with the cultural aspect of being a workless household. So how do you address something like that? Because despite what Scottish ministers might think, there's real resentment in communities, particularly working class communities, where people are getting out 6 and 7 in the morning to put in a shift for living wage, and they see people across the road who appear to get a lot of benefits and are not contributing to society in the same way, nor are they encouraging their children to do so. So how do you look at not so much one particular benefit, but the in the round in terms of the impact on wider society?
So many of the aspects, Convener, that you mentioned there are available to people both in and out of work, and it's whether they are deemed to be in poverty or in receipt of certain reserved benefits.
I referred to that earlier when I said 57% of people in universal credit are in work.
So that's where, if we see the comparison between somebody in and out of work, that context is very important. The other aspects, which of course is very important when it comes to this, is around the work that the government does around employability schemes to ensure that there is support for those that are out of work to get in to work. Recent examples in terms of investment are around parental employability and also for disability employability specific support for both those groups. So those are important aspects. And I think the final point I would make is that the targeted work that goes on, particularly for those in low incomes, is to ensure that they have a level of support which allows them to provide for their family, but as is regularly told to me by other organisations, it still does not meet, in effect, what is required by that family to allow them to meet the essentials of life. So there is a challenge on the government from others to increase expenditure on aspects around social security because of the inadequacy of reserved benefits. But I would say that the work that we do, particularly on low-income families within social security, it is targeted to low-income families, and it is to a method of uplifting income to provide further support. And the recent work that was produced certainly in the last couple of weeks around the evaluation of the 5 family payments is again another type of work that we've done, an evaluation of the impact of the 5 family payments that can perhaps assist with that final point that you were making, Convener.
Yes, I think it's important. It's about the balance to be struck and where we can get the best for individuals concerned and for the public pound going forward. But with employability, a lot of these courses seem to be getting cut, and that is of real concern, certainly to the committee. Okay, I think we'll leave it there. What I'll just say to wind up is if there are any other points that you feel have not been raised that you wish to make to the committee before we wind up, and please feel free to do so.
No, I think we've covered quite a lot, and we'll get back on some other issues in writing with some of the details that committees asked for.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You've put in quite a stretch today, so thank you, Cabinet Secretary. It's very much appreciated. With that, I'll just call a 2-minute break to allow official report and broadcasting to leave, along with our guests, and then we'll go into a brief private session.